morning. My name is Lilia Opresk, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome you all at this conference. Today is the day which marks the start of Russia's war in Ukraine for 10 years ago, the start of illegal annexation of Crimea. And today is also the day when the Ukrainian armed forces are fighting against the biggest country in the world along more than 1,500 kilometers long front line. So we want to discuss the resilience today, accountability, as well as European cooperation in the face of this major threat, not only to Ukraine, but also to Europe. But before we continue with our program today, I would like to welcome here the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Karl-Harald Sovik.
Thank you for that, Lilia, and dear all, welcome to this conference. And a special welcome to our guests that had traveled, and indeed a hearty welcome to our guest from Ukraine. It is good to see you, even though I would have preferred to be here discussing a different topic. I was invited to Ukraine in 2019 to give a lecture, but unfortunately, I couldn't go. It is unbelievable that the country that I would have then experienced for the first time is now in the most extensive war in Europe since World War II. A special thanks to Lilia for organizing together also with Artem and with Tarja, and for planning, and I know it is a lot of work, so thank you so much, Lilia. War is always devastating and causes immense suffering, especially for civilians. We live in a peaceful part of the world, but it's not that many years since Norway was occupied. If we now, because of the building, you cannot look out of the window and see a Holen primary school that was bombed, not by the Germans, but by British planes who was intending to hit the German submarine base, which was just nearby, and almost 200 persons were killed, 61 of them children. This is a small tragedy compared with the loss of Ukrainian. But it reminds us that war is closer than we would like to think. Russia, as you mentioned, has been waging a war on Ukraine for a decade. The annexation of Crimea, followed by the war in Eastern Europe since 2019, and then the full-scale attack all over Ukrainian territory since 24th of February 2022. The topics of this seminar, they are important. How has the Ukrainian society been coping with the war, and what's the key to its resilience? What are the ways to bring justice both domestically and internationally, and why does it matter? And also, why is the European cooperation so important? We should remember that the threat that Ukraine poses on Russia, at least the threat that Russia feels, is due to Ukrainian move towards Western Europe and the strive for values that we all share, democracy and the rule of law. Ukraine is fighting a war that is of essence not only for the country, but also for the rest of Europe. That's why this seminar is so important, and I would like to thank you all for participating, either in presence or online. So with these words of welcome, I would leave the floor to Lilia and to the program of the seminar. So thank you.
Many thanks, Karl-Harald, for this word. And now we will also have an address from Ihor Holovchenko, who is acting ambassador of Ukraine in Norway. He will be with us on screen from Oslo. So please, Ihor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the floor provided. Good morning, everyone. I wish to thank the University of Bergen for inviting me to deliver these remarks at the outset of today's conference. I hope next time I will be able to join you in person. In my short statement, I wish to focus on what happened over the past year since the previous conference took place, and even more important, on what we need to do in the months to come. First, the current situation on the battlefield is quite different from the one we faced in February 2023. Expectations for a fast victory have vanished as Russia has placed its entire economy on a war footing. Its military and industrial facilities are operating at full capacity, and its military spending reached record heights. We are now facing a war of attrition in which long-term planning, sustainable financing, and sufficient resources will play a key role. Ukraine's resilience and the path to victory heavily depend on external support provided by our allies and partners. And I wish to emphasize a very essential contribution made by Norway to this cause. Second, the scale of economic destruction caused by Russia has only grown over 2023. Russian artillery razes Ukrainian towns to the ground. Russian missiles and drones attack residential areas and critical infrastructure far away from the front line. Millions of Ukrainians remain refugees abroad. Norway alone provided safe haven to more than 70,000 of Ukrainian citizens. Families are separated. Children are growing up in foreign countries. Along with these two negative trends, there are plenty of reasons for optimism. We do not need any longer to explain what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. We do not need to convince that it is in the interest of entire Europe to stop Russia. This is already clear to everyone. The question remains how to achieve this. The NATO must restart its military-industrial complex, which has been dormant for decades. Much has been accomplished along the way, but much more lies ahead. First, bilateral security agreements were signed by Ukraine with the UK, Germany, and France. More are coming. Negotiations with Norway will start very soon. Ukrainian military managed to stop Russian occupiers on land. Last year, we have successfully expelled Russian warships from the western part of the Black Sea and restored civilian navigation. This year, we need to gain air superiority. Contrary to expectations by the Kremlin, Ukraine's economy and society have withstood. The GDP recovered with 5% growth in 2023, inflation remains low, and the economy keeps working. There are no power outages and blackouts. We received a generous external support. It allowed to repair dozens of thousands of civilian facilities, residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, roads, and bridges. Over the past year, we have shifted our focus in cooperation with partners from covering the immediate needs, to creating a long-term basis for defending against Russia for as long as it takes. Production and repairs of weapons are being deployed in Ukraine. This will simplify logistics and make us less vulnerable to political considerations abroad. Despite the ongoing full-scale war, reforms continue in Ukraine. We are starting negotiations on joining the EU. We have received a 4-year program worth 50 billion euros from the EU. We keep following our Euro-Atlantic track, moving closer to the NATO membership. Ukraine launched a number of diplomatic initiatives aimed at engaging countries across the globe and demonstrating our readiness for peace. The most comprehensive framework is ensured by the Ukrainian peace formula. It provides opportunities for different countries to choose the fields they are ready to contribute to. Norway has been a very active participant in this mechanism. Many ideas that were considered unrealistic have in fact been realized. For instance, the International Register of Damage caused by Russia's aggression against Ukraine was initiated. The core group on the establishment of special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine started its work. Russia has been recognized as a sponsor of terrorism or a terrorist country by a number of countries and international structures. Most recently, the International Court of Justice concluded that Russia violated 2 international conventions for the suppression of the financing of terrorism and on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. The EU is paving the way for the use of revenues from the frozen Russian assets in favor of Ukraine. Meaningful discussions continue on how to make these assets available for Ukraine in whole. My key message to you, the participants of today's conference, would be that we should never stop. Let's keep seeking for new ideas, new mechanisms, new frameworks. It is in everyone's interest to ensure that Russia's crimes against Ukraine are punished, justice is restored, and the unacceptability of such actions is clearly demonstrated. I thank you.
Many thanks, Ihor, for this welcoming address. And now we will proceed with the first panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce Anatoly Kirilluk, who is senior advisor at NURAD, Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation, especially the Department for the Nonsense Support Program for Ukraine. So please, Anatoly.
Okay, that's it here. Should I? No. Then I can start from here. Thank you, Lilia. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure for me to come back to the University of Bergen 10 years since I was a student here myself. Since then, I had the opportunity to work in such places as the Parliament of Ukraine. Is something wrong with the sound? Yeah, thank you. The last 7 years, I worked in the Norwegian Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce in Oslo, and last year I joined NORAD, the Nansen program, to help Ukraine to resist further. And we have quite substantial funds to manage, but we have to manage them wisely, and we have to base our management on the knowledge, and that's why it is important the work the universities are doing. And I have to admit that it is it warms my heart really much to come back here now, because I recall 10 years ago sitting me in the library and trying to write my master thesis when Euromaidan started, and then Crimea was annexed, and then the war in the Donbass started. I felt quite lonely. We were some very few students from Ukraine studying here. So we even gathered ourselves in the center of Bergen in front of the Blåstein. I don't know if you can show the picture. If not, it's not that important, but we were standing there and explaining people what was happening, and it also gave us the feeling of unity with our people in Ukraine and elsewhere who were demonstrating. But now coming back and we see Lilia working here, Artem, Daniil, Marina in the University of Agder in Kristiansand, and Gaine up in the north. It gives me feeling that now finally the knowledge about what is about the events that are so important to all of us, to the whole Europe, is paid enough attention. And so thank you for organizing this and working for the. Before we jump into the panel discussion, I just would like to take down the confusion, because even when I told last week that I'm going to the university and the topic was 10 years of war, and people were like a little bit confused. Why 10 years? We were marking first year of full-scale war last year. So it's a simplified timeline that in, just to remind you that in November 2013, there started the Revolution of Dignity, or Euromaidan, or just Maidan as we would recall it many times during this panel, I suppose. And it lasted until February 2014. And the night, 21st of February, Yanukovych left Ukraine, and the 22nd of February, he was deposed by the Parliament of Ukraine with 328 votes. And already in February 26, Russia started the annexation of Crimea, which was officially finished in March 18th, when Putin signed documents and held the grand ceremony. And already in April, a group of Russian soldiers with no signs, but led by the Russian officers, took control over the city Slovyansk in Donetsk. And that was a kind of start of the war, all these events. And with this as a background, I would like to invite our first panelist, Danil Butenko. He's a PhD and determined Ukrainian social activist and researcher from Sumy, and currently working at the University of Bergen and the Helse Bergen Hospital Trust. His research focuses on criminal and accountability and insanity. And Danil's story is not about just his academic achievements, but also hands-on fight for Ukrainian freedom. So can you tell us your story, Danil?
Yeah, thank you, Anatoly. The reason why I'm here is that when the panel was assembled, there was an idea that we will talk about the revolution and as a departing point for the following 10 years of war. And my proposition was that we will add to the factual discussion and to discussion of, from the academic perspective, of causes and consequences of these events, that it would be beneficial for such conversation to add emotion color by means of talking about lived experiences of that time. And I was at the time a student in a medical university. As by background, I'm a psychiatrist, and I was actively participating in the revolution from the very start till the very end, balancing in between travels to Kiev, where the key events were happening, and participating in action back in my city, which is city 50 kilometers away from the Russian border, in the northeast. And so in this conversation, I would like to bring in perspective of a person who comes from a border region where through my whole life, I experienced consequences of being being born in a country that has been for many long decades a colony of Russia as a part of the Soviet Union, and how me coming from that region where 90% of people were talking Russian, I still felt profoundly Ukrainian and willing to build a European-oriented state, rather than returning back to values and the status of the colony of the Russian Empire.
So what exactly pushed you to go from place like Sumy to Kiev? Because it's like you were, which year of the university were you studying it?
That was third year of university, and being in medical university, typically you see that people are quite passive politically. They are bothered with their textbooks and handbooks. They are overcrowded with material and with exams. So the list of participation in among studentship from all the faculties is typically in medical university. But nevertheless, I believe that some combination of reasons of me growing in a family that has participated in previous Orange Revolution in 2004, and growing in a family that through my upbringing was criticizing and depicting in negative light the years of Ukraine during Soviet as part of the Soviet Union. I felt that as the government of, at the time, President Yanukovych was unfolding, and the way he and his government were handling Euro integration and balancing between wishes of the population and their own ambitions was not fitting the way I felt about political direction that our state should take. And
so was there any specific action of the former government that like gave you a signal? Now I have to go to Kiev. Now I cannot stay passive in the comfortable university and doing my studies.
yeah, so in the end of November, as there was a process of political or trade integration into EU. His government, after President's visit to Sochi in Russia, they changed the discourse and declared that we are not anymore going to sign the agreements. We are not going to join in the EU. And so I saw in news that student protests in Kyiv have started. We had our own protest in the city that I'm in, where we were declaring that we as a group of active young people, we want to see ourselves as part of EU in some future. So we want the government to take steps towards that. And we do not want them to exchange this deal for the opposite deal with Russia, and to, as that felt threatening, as that felt a way of, as another step towards reintegration into the status of a colony.
Mm. And what would it mean to you practically? Like if we stayed on that discourse and were united more with Russia, what would it mean to you personally, and how the future looked for you at that point?
It would mean my liberties being shackled by the power that denies existence of my nation, that denies the right for me to choose basically politicians that represent my interests, that I would be locked as a citizen in a loop of inescapable totalitarianism, where there would be no right and no space to make a choice to execute civil rights, to participate in building country the way I would want it to be built. And that drove me to Maidan. That drove me to taking a more active stance to reassure that we are heard, that I'm heard.
So you came to Kyiv, to Maidan. Can you share how it was? What did you feel when you come there, and how the first days of your participation looked like, and how it developed further?
Well, that was fantastic, because what preceded my trip to Kyiv was that, and I was there the day before students were beaten. So I came there during the day, and students were beaten during the night, on Friday night. I don't remember the date. And so I was excited to see vast amounts of people, and if you could show photos, that would be very nice. Vast amounts of people with Ukrainian flags, speaking Ukrainian. Yeah. And important bit was that when I was trying to find ways to get to Maidan, the thing is that at the time, I didn't have really resources, financial resources, to get myself a ticket to go there. And I started seeking different opportunities, and a friend of mine from the university, he was part of the pro-president party. He was kind of a student parliament member. And he approached me and said that, oh, I know that you want to go to Kyiv. We are arranging a trip to Kyiv to support our president, and you'll be also paid to do that. Do you want that? I told him to sort of, because that was exact way of ruining the civil democracy by seeking disadvantaged people and buying them. So I found my way through another party, through a nationalistic party that brought me in there with a group of other students with no demands and no agenda to execute, but pure because of the scene that we had an interest to execute our civil rights. Yeah, and so this was excitement. This was a feeling that I'm surrounded by people who see and feel themselves being Ukrainians, who are not a threat to stand against the power and reassure that they are heard by the government.
Yeah, I remember myself traveling from Bergen to Ukraine at that time, and it looked more like a festival, kind of, at most of the days. But then it escalated, and people got killed, as we know, and even some monuments were taken down. Can you tell more about that?
Yeah. So the week after this initial events, when students were beaten, and then in a day there was this march of millions, where vast amounts of Ukrainians from all over Ukraine came to being pissed with the viciousness, the malice of the political regime and of the police. So the week after that, I came again because I was coming to Kyiv during weekends and going back due to studies during work days. And so the weekend after, we started taking down the monuments of Lenin. And I have here the trophy from the time as I was one of those who was crushing it down. And that was the act of denying very tangibly, very physically, the, so to say, the obelisks, the objects of colonization that were the embodiment of this slavery that we had been shackled in. And so the action was directed to illustrate that we deny the desires of searching powers to return to such a state where we would be praising foreign leaders and bringing them to the status of some deities. And that was this action in Kyiv then caused so-called Leninapad throughout Ukraine, where we had more than several thousand of monuments of Lenin throughout Ukraine. And
I actually did some research when you told that you will bring this piece of Lenin to find out how many Lenins we took down, and I can start with the first ever Lenin monument taken down was actually in Ukraine, but not the one you took, but the one in city Chervonograd, west in Ukraine, and it was taken down by very peaceful means by the decision of the local government in 1990, and it was unheard before that any Lenin monument from the former Soviet states would be taken down. But then after the events in Maidan, we took down only Lenin's monuments, 1,300 of them. We have even like the map in Ukraine where still more than 300 monuments are still on the map, but they are on the occupied territories. So we have to take the territories back first and then to finish the work started, Daniil.
Well, I should say that there were hundreds of us, all right? It was several tons of weight too. There was a truck pulling it down, and we were just crushing it with hammers afterwards. So that's shouldn't be understood as my single action.
Yeah, and I saw like in the news recently that the Estonian Prime Minister, was on the wanted list by Russians for her politics against the historical monuments in Estonia. And from time to time, I also read the articles about the monuments up in the north in Norway, which Russia treat or used to treat in like kind of the same way as why they put the monuments of Lenin in Ukraine. I'm not encouraging you to do anything with the monuments in Norway, but do you recall anything like maybe we should reconsider our attitude to the monuments that are so important for Russia?
Well, it is of importance to say that to define this we, because I, being Ukrainian, have a very definite attitude towards that. Now, there are Norwegian people who have their state and who have this monument on their land. I have no right, no wish to direct on what must be done. There are, in my experience of living here, there is a very potent and very developed civil society here that is also very educated. And so I would assume that processes of relation or reevaluation of partnerships with Russia, of the role of Russia in the past, is something that is ever shifting, and that happens here as anywhere else naturally, not just with Russia, but just same with any other state that has been or still is an imperialist power. And indeed, it appears that Russians do use our Russian state does use those monuments in Baltic countries in the north as certain means of maintaining a particular narrative about their crucial role in being the sole victors of the World Second War. And I believe that there is space for discussion there, that Soviet, for example, should not be associated explicitly with Russia, because it was a congregation of states, and there were different nations that were troops during the war. And there was, of course, the role of Russia in causing the war by means of the pact between Ribbentrop and Molotov. That is something that also must be remembered and taken into account when relating to the role of the Soviets in those events. But once again, I believe that again, through experience of living here, I see that there is an ongoing discussion and ongoing shift in the perception of the contemporary Russian state and their role in global security.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Please stay with us because I may ask you some more questions, but we have also other participants with us today, and we have Katerina Zarembo online. We are thrilled to welcome you, Katerina. Katerina is based in Kyiv, and she is social scientist currently affiliated with the Technical University of Darmstadt and Central European University in Vienna. She is also an associate fellow at the New Europe Center, Ukraine, and her research brings together security and civil society studies. And Katerina, I managed to read the paper you sent me on my way to Bergen, and I noticed that your research talks about exactly how these big events like Euromaidan and the Russian invasion changed the way people in Ukraine come together and act and answer those events. Can you tell us more about how these events changed the people views and actions and what we can see on the ground in the Ukrainian society?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Anatoly, and thank you very much, the organizers of this conference. It is my great privilege to be here with you today virtually. Today, Ukraine also commemorates the Heavenly 100, so those first 100, roughly 100 victims, actually more, of the Yanukovych regime who were shot during the Euromaidan. And it is an important example and maybe starting point of this contemporary civilian resistance and fight for freedom, which unfortunately became violent and led to human losses. I prepared my talk today according to the general theme of the panel, which is human resilience. And this is something I've been researching with civil society generally being my topic of research for the last 10 years. And I would like to tell you about how, what exactly we observe on the ground currently regarding Ukraine's resilience, what we also don't observe. So basically, resilience has become the buzzword in the security studies before the full-scale Russian aggression, right? This was the word of the year in the European EU foreign policy, renewed foreign policy strategy in 2016. But I would say that from my observation after Russia's full-scale invasion, resilience generally, but rooting in stemming from the empirical data from Ukraine's societal fabric, has even gained in being the buzzword. So currently there is a lot of research published, there are conferences held around the concept of resilience and what it can bring in order to understand the behavior of states and societies. I'm relying on the paper which my colleague from Sweden, Julia Jurchuk, working at the Swedish University, and myself have just finished. And our purpose is to revisit the concept of resilience, not so much from the theoretical, but rather from empirical perspective, demonstrating also the dangers of over-relying on resilience for us as theorists and practitioners. Because currently what we observe in the academic society is that the resilience is treated somehow uncritically and positively, not in the positivist meaning of the term, but in the general meaning of terms of positively and as some kind of a superpower. And if we look at the data from Ukraine, from Ukraine's field, then we will see that it's some kind of being superhumans, beating enemies with their own lands. The research also demonstrates, the media research also demonstrates certain myths which have been created in and around Ukraine, especially in 2022. Ukrainians as superpower nation, this David versus Goliath myth, so kind of revisiting, this weaker opponent gaining strength against the stronger one. So some kind of super power, superheroes like Patron and other fictionary characters, the Ghost of Kiev, the pilot, and so on and so forth. But basically what we are actually dealing with, and what is very visible also to me as the researcher based in Ukraine, is that we deal with normal people, average people, different people living in abnormal conditions. And I think this somehow slips away from the attention, and this is what we dedicated our paper to. So the dangers of over-relying on resilience. If we think about resilience as resistance, then I have to say that it is not true that the resilience has waned in Ukraine. So despite the fact that resilience is hard to sustain over long term and in the under the conditions of so lack of certainty in uncertain conditions, even if the Ukrainians manifest and say it outright they are tired. Some people are tired. In fact, if we look at the data of participation, then we would see that the participation has not waned. So if we compare different surveys from 2022 and 2023, at the end of 2023, we would see that the engagement in active volunteering or let's say part-time help for military and civilians like internal displaced persons, but mostly military, actually even increased depending on how you ask. So it always depends on the methodology and how the question is formulated. So for example, fewer people, like 12% in the recent survey by Democratic Initiatives Foundation, describe themselves as active volunteers, but then 25 said that they help partially, like come to weave camouflage nets or come to some actions and events which are held in support of the Ukrainian army. So if you add this up, then if we compare this to the data from 2022, like April service, for example, March service, you will see that in some respect, the participation even increased. The donations definitely increased. Currently, around 60% of Ukrainians, sometimes more than 60%, say that they donate regularly, and the figure was slightly lower in 2022 even. If we look at the actual number of the sums generated, we checked the revenues, the funds raised by the two biggest civilian foundations created by volunteers. So Come Back Alive, the voluntary fund, which operates since 2016, and Pratula Foundation, which operated slightly later. And we can see that their revenues actually fell. Come Back Alive by 20% in 2023 as compared to 2022, and Pratula Foundation by 50%, so cut by half. But if we look at the numbers raised, then we will see that it's billions of hryvnias anyway. And there are other fundraisers, like state fundraiser United 24, for example, which outreaches globally, and they also bring revenues in billions. So it's anyway significant sums, which should be also borne in mind. Last but not least, 88% of Ukrainians continue to believe in Ukraine's victory. So it's absolute majority of Ukrainians, and this demonstrates that even if we have some slight decline in some indicators, in any case, this is absolute and overwhelming support by the absolute majority of the population, both rhetorically and in practice, so in actions. But then we see also challenges, and the challenges are what worries us as researchers and practitioners. And the challenges belong to the fact that there are fewer people left, right? So there are fewer Ukrainians left. This is a fact. The fewer Ukrainians there are, both physically, we do not know the amount of losses, military and civilian losses overall, if we add them up in these 10 years of war, and especially in the last 2 years, because this is the classified information. But if you go to any cemetery in Ukraine, in any village or city, you would see blue and yellow flags, so Ukraine's national flags, over some graves, which demonstrate that the military is buried there. So the losses are distributed across whole of society, and this is a significant amount anyway. PEN Ukraine made a list of people of culture who were either killed in action, so joined the front line, the army as military, or as civilians, and their list as of now comprises of 96 people, so people of culture. The list is based on open data only, so there are also other people we don't yet know about, and PEN Ukraine disclaims that this is a non-exhaustive list. My point is that basically this is the people which will never take part in the rebuilding of the Ukraine, in the creation of the state onwards, and this is the irreparable loss. Yes, the loss which we can not do anything to substitute with. Then there are, of course, the refugees. So currently we have the population of Ukraine diminished by roughly 1/7, so around 6 million of refugees are currently abroad. Plus the birth rate in Ukraine in 2023 dropped by 32%. So we are dealing with a demographic crisis as a result of the Russian war against Ukraine, and this is also something to be borne in mind. Then another thing is the mental health, which can be, some kind of dismissed, right, as a non the problem not of the first scale. But in fact, if we look, so there are kind of these two strands of study of resilience. If we look at political science, then it's about national resilience and societal resilience, or resilience of vast, large group of people. But if we look at psychological studies, we would see that they speak mostly about individual resilience, right? Society is comprised of individuals, and these individuals' levels of resilience are also different depending on the resources you have, internal and external. And these two resiliences, they build upon each other and they depend upon each other. So if every single person, there is something wrong and the resources diminish, then the national and this collective resilience also diminishes. We currently observe that only 15% of Ukrainians engage in long-term planning, and long-term planning is like 6 to 12 months. And then people do not make long-term plans just because they cannot imagine their future. Well, in my opinion, this would say midterm. We also have the emphasis on the mental health, which is demonstrated by the First Lady, so by Olena Zelenska. This is one of the priorities of her work, so sustaining people in their psychological state. And the fact that she invests efforts in this, and some specialists, like, for example, UNICEF, pay much attention and dedicate many resources to mental health of children, for example, and young adults, demonstrate that this is a problem, right? So if we think about resilience, then in longer term, resilience is diminished by mental health problems. And probably the last point about this practical aspect of resilience, so societal cleavages, which we observe in Ukraine, they are partially grasped by CEDA's think tank, a qualitative survey. So it's not about racial distribution, but it is rather about finding out what kind of cleavages there are in society. And the point is that the takeaway is that the trauma, this collective trauma of war experience differently. It is not distributed evenly. This amount of grief is distributed unevenly across society. Some people serve in the army and some do not. And basically some people expect to wait for their loved ones in the army and others don't. These two worlds find it hard to understand each other. And some people lost, of course, their loved ones or their homes and had to migrate or did not. And some didn't have this experience. Then some have more means of to live off and some have less. Some people left the country as refugees, and some stayed or returned soon. And so there are all these various experiences which people under the condition of significant and so stress, which comes without any intervals, any pauses, try to feel resentment, and this sometimes demonstrates in society as a resentment, or at least is acknowledged so in the service done. So basically, I think we can go on with these points of segments, factors which affect resilience. But my my concluding point would be that admiring resilience can be used also as an excuse for not doing enough, for providing help to survive but not to win. And it's very important to understand that the sooner Ukraine wins, the more resources there will be for quality rebuilding of the Ukrainian state and sustaining its democracy. And the longer war goes, the fewer resources there will be. I think this human side of resilience is the aspect which is very often overlooked, and when we speak about the Ukrainian battle and resistance against Russia, and also aid for Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Katerina. So basically, to summarize in a couple of words, people in Ukraine are really tired and the resources are very low to maintain this level of resilience. And you said the sentence, providing help to survive, but not to win. What, based on your findings and observations, what your advice would be to the international community? what kind of help and in which amounts would be best for Ukraine right now?
I think partially the answer to this question is already provided by our colleague from the embassy. Basically, the reboot of the military industrial base in Europe is absolutely necessary, both for Ukraine and for Europe, I would say, because I think for us Ukrainians, maybe the word is, okay, I'm looking for the right word here. So I think that finally we see some kind of realistic scenarios from Ukraine. It looks like realistic scenarios when we see that in the UK, in Sweden, probably in Norway as well, there is discussion about what actually we do if Russia attacks further. And what we see now, and I think the Munich Security Conference also provides us with some insights on this. I would cite here with Professor Snyder, Timothy Snyder, the historian, and he said that the global, this is a global war, which various various juxtapositions, various battles fought already in different parts of the world, but with only one land so far experiencing an all-out land and sea and air, also the war in the traditional sense. Only one state so far, Ukraine and Ukraine's territory, but it can also expand. And the fact that this realization comes in the world and specifically in Europe, I think it's a very, well, it could be also, of course, earlier, but if it's now, it's better late than never. So the investing in one's own defense, doing as much as possible together with Ukraine, again, to be honest, it is, I cannot give you the exact amount of, how many F-16s and Taurus we need. So I do not have these numbers right now. But it is absolutely clear that Ukraine needs arms all the time because arms are finite resource. And this is, so if we don't have arms, then we lose more people. And this is pretty clear. So the sustainable aid and help to help defeat Russia not as a single kind of evil state, but as a part of this evil axe comprising Iran and North Korea, will have long-reaching implications for the autocracies, nuclear powers in this world. This is absolutely clear, and I think if we stop, if anyone goes on treating it as some kind of local conflict, then we should stop doing so because this is the local dimension of a global conflict going on.
Your words remind me one of the recent meetings I had in capacity of NORAD when we asked Ukrainian journalists what we can do from Norway to help you to maintain the freedom of speech, freedom of media in Ukraine. And the answer was, Anatoly, we need more ammunition. We take the responsibility for freedom of media when we win the war, but now it's ammunition what is needed. You had also a comment, Daniil?
Yeah, two brief comments. One is, as these were hard quantitative arguments in relation to resistance, I wanted to reflect on how I observed that character being built and developed back in my region again, where I come from. As I mentioned, due to the colonial history, majority of population has been using Russian as their main language. But then along with this events of revolutions and build-up of independent media, of non-governmental organization, there was evocation in terms of understanding that the reasons for why I and my parents speak this language, for why we have so much of Russian culture present here, is these decades of colony. And so there was ever-building defiance that I very happy to observe being ever increasing over the years, and with the full-scale invasion causing another unmeasurable push towards people understanding how they have been twisted into not having connection, not having the roots of Ukrainians, and making a proactive choice to change that. And the other comment relates to the mental health part, that with every day of the war, and here I'm putting on my hat as a psychiatrist, the amount and character of trauma is building, and we can provide healthcare in terms of normal incidents of mental health problems in very limited capacity. Even most resourceful countries, such as Norway, struggle to structure mental health care in such a way to address the need that exists. Now, in the country where there is ongoing war, trauma is persistent through all groups, whether you're civilian, whether you are military, in different variations of severity. But I'm afraid that we are at that point where it won't be possible to address by means of healthcare to rehabilitate the population. So the only effective way is to cut off the cause of the trauma, that is the war, by means of supplying, again, enough ammunition, enough of vehicles needed to take down the enemy and reassure that the trauma source has ceased, causing inevitable deteriorating impact on the Ukrainian people.
So we have to work on different directions. Katerina, please stay with us in case we have questions to you later, but we have to move forward and look a little bit now in the future and potential Ukrainian integration with the EU. And today we are excited to have with us Marina Rabinovich, postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Science and Management, University of Agder. She has been studying how Ukraine and European Union work together, especially through a very important agreement between Ukraine and the EU. Dr. Rabinovich knows a lot about Ukraine's interactions with the European Union and the role of people's movement in making the changes and changes in the legislation, but also in the society. So the floor is yours, Marina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anatoly, and thank you very much, Lilia, and all the colleagues for having organized the event today. Also very happy to see Katerina, a good colleague of mine, yeah, with whom we have spent quite some time at international conferences and also privately discussing where we are going in terms of European integration. And just we start by reminding that Euromaidan is not the first revolution we have been having in Ukraine, because what makes Ukraine quite different from, let's say, the situation in Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, what makes it different from the situation in Russia is that we have had 3 successful revolutions. And the first one was the revolution on granite in the 90s, then the Orange Revolution in 2004, the first revolution I still remember from the school times, when it still was quite, an enormous event for that period. And then the Euromaidan is the third one. And my talk is partly based on the blog published in the very beginning of the war at the democracy blog we have at the University of Agder. And my main point there has been that the war is to some extent the 4th revolution for us. And hopefully this 4th one will also be successful. But when it comes to social movements, I think it's very important to have the experience of successful revolutions, because the success of the Orange Revolution, the success of the Euromaidan, this is something that gives people an idea that if you have some common goals and if you're dissatisfied with something, it's possible to change it. And this is something this is the experience that Russia lacks to a big extent. unfortunately. And if we think even now of these recent events of Navalny death, there have been people who were going out and trying to put flowers to some places, but even the number of these people is quite few. And had we imagined there had been millions, the situation in Europe would have been very different. And one of the reasons is that these people, they don't have any direct experience of this kind of victorious revolution as we had. And also, I don't know how much time I have, these experiences of victorious revolutions have been going quite well hand in hand with the European integration. And let us say that all these revolutions are just kind of steps on the way to joining the EU as a goal. And I think this should be also seen a bit bigger, not just joining the EU as signing the accession treaty one day and become a member and having Ukrainian flag in Brussels where all other flags of EU member states are, but rather departing from the very gloomy past of Soviet concentration camps and all the misery of that regime to a much more fair and, let's say, human-friendly and prosperous place.
We heard from the very beginning that it is the feeling of sharing the same values with the EU, which pushed people to the streets and to fight for their rights and so on. But it's one thing to share the values with the EU, but another thing to actually put those values into practice. So how has Ukraine worked on bringing those values to life and its laws, and not only in the laws, but also in practicing those laws? Can you elaborate more about since, for instance, Euromaidan? How Ukraine succeed in those reforms?
So there have been multiple reforms. I think the word reform as well as resilience at some point also became a buzzword for us because everything had the label of reform. And nevertheless, some of them have been quite successful, especially if we think of decentralization. And this is also one of the topics I have been working on. And decentralization reform, it helped to basically recreate the Ukraine's administrative territorial organization. Because before decentralization, there have been a lot of very small and weak communities, more than 1,000 across the whole country. Decentralization helped to amalgamate many of them and create, I guess, to say, stronger units of local self-government. Also, they got many more powers than they had and a stronger financial base just directly coming from the budget code and tax code. And there is also research showing that decentralization really helped to get more power to the ground and ensure that people trust local leaders much more than before. So also these units of decentralization, they helped a lot during the invasion because local leaders knew quite well whom to address, how to get different kind of resources. So I would say decentralization is probably the most important reform that helped to empower people from the ground. And probably last thing to say that the Russians were quite, to say, in a negative sense, amazed about this because they were all the time asking when they first started the invasion, okay, and who is the main person here, who is the main person there, and there was no answer because the citizens in the communities all felt themselves as, let us say, co-responsible for what has been going on. So they started taking mayors in captivity, but this also didn't help because there have been other people who knew quite well what had been going on in the communities, and they didn't manage by taking mayors in captivity to ruin the situation locally. I would say that we had also this bad joke that why Russians are bombing the residential buildings is just because we have centers of power everywhere. And this has been the decentralization that created this sense that many people are centers of power and we all together doing important things.
I just have to ask that question because since I started working in NURA, this comes as question number 1 or number 2. What about corruption in Ukraine? Because it is also a buzzword, and I felt like from my times working in as advisor in the parliament that we did quite well, but still it is like stamp on Ukraine. And it feels like it doesn't matter what we do, this will go along with us quite for some time still.
Has been also a question that I have been asked a lot by everyone and everywhere. They think that we cannot say that corruption is non-existent. It would be a lie to say that there is no corruption. On the other hand, if we think about corruption in other places and political corruption elsewhere, when, for example, one can read that even the US leaders get support from Russia during the elections, is not that also corruption? Or is not that corruption that Viktor Orban constantly says maybe Ukraine's EU accession will block European future and will create new power center? But don't we know that he also is quite connected to not just the European Union and is being called not just Trojan horse, but even already a Trojan donkey? So we should accept the fact that corruption is endemic in many societies, and there are many ways to address it, and I think it's easier to address corruption in technical terms. For example, there have been quite some observation missions from the US saying that they didn't find evidence that weapons that the US gave to Ukraine was somehow misused or used in a corrupt way. So in technical level, it's much easier. There are many technical systems that help to counter corruption. However, I think what is really lacking is an emphasis on political corruption. But this is a problem not just in Ukraine, but also Europe-wide and I'll say worldwide, because also there are many things we don't know about the interconnections that take place much higher levels than we usually associate corruption with.
Thank you, Marina. We have coffee break approaching, but we still have a couple of minutes for very short questions, if there are any. Quick questions. Yeah, we have one there.
It should be in English, I suppose.
Yeah, it would be.
My name is Torvald Grant. I have a question related to the UN Charter. The UN Charter says that when you are attacked by another state, your war against that attack is fair and reasonable and should be supported by the international community. And Robert Mood, he taught me, I don't know if it's correct, he taught me that to win a war, you have to have more soldiers than the enemy. It's the state with most soldiers that win. Whether that's correct or not, I'm not quite sure. But my question is, in the UN, there are 120 states that say that they are independent of the superpowers. They don't want to join in under superpower military alliances. Now, most of Europe has, of course, joined NATO, so the non-aligned movement has very little support in Europe. But my question is, has Ukraine authorities, have they approached the non-aligned movement and with the question whether it is possible for them to support the struggle in Ukraine also with soldiers?
Who wants to answer that question?
I think I could take it.
Yeah, that there have been quite many discussions about the so-called global south and the role of global south in the war. So I don't think that somebody really approached in terms of global South countries in terms of soldiers, and it's in many countries it's prohibited officially for citizens to participate in wars in other countries. Like, for example, Russia got some soldiers in Nepal unofficially, and now the government of Nepal is not really happy about it and is trying to ensure that their citizens don't participate in the wars. So it's quite uncommon to get citizens from foreign countries officially via the UN to participate in some kind of wars. So it would have been possible probably to get some munitions, to get some humanitarian help, and this has been achieved, for example, with Emirates. So they are providing humanitarian help, with some of the others and provide non-lethal help. But at the same time, many of the global South countries, they joined BRICS, where Russia plays quite an important role, and therefore just geopolitically they are also quite afraid to go beyond humanitarian, non-lethal kind of equipment and help. And just maybe to shortly say about the first thing about the number of soldiers. I think contemporary wars, they are so much technological that we have another saying, also not a good one, but I think with this war there are many bad sayings which have deep sense, that is being said that iron usually wins from meat. So sometimes it's much more important to have more ammunition, drones, planes than just people who are still very, very vulnerable as beings.
Thank you, Marina. Yeah,
Yeah.
you had the comment, Katerina.
Yeah, I think Marina rather covered what I wanted to say. I think also the point about people is rather erroneous, indeed. So what Ukraine needs is ammunition and domination in the air much more than more people too. But this is definitely not the primary concern.
Thank you, Katerina. And yeah, I think now we have already stretched this panel, but Daniil had one last announcement.
Yeah, as another way to bring color to the conference is that we have assembled a small exposition of artwork. They are made by my father, who is an all Ukrainian who stays and lives in Ukraine. He has no art. He has no education in arts, and nevertheless, art became for him the main tool of coping with the fact of war and with dealing with the traumatic experiences that he keeps living through. And so you're very welcome to explore his artwork and to read on the screen the description of this collection. And the idea is to communicate to you by other means than words and facts delivered via them, the character and nature of war by means of its visual representations made by man who lives in the war.
Thank you, Daniil. And thank you for participation, Katerina, Marina, and Daniil.
So now we are ready for our second panel for this day, and I would like to introduce you to Professor Knut Einar Skodvin, who will be the moderator of the panel. Next to him, we have Gayane Nurijayan. She is Associate Professor at the Arctic University of Norway. We have Artem Nazarko. He is a PhD candidate here at the University of Bergen and Marie Curie Scholarship for Ukraine Fellow. And also we have Terje Einarsen, Professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Bergen. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I think on behalf of all of us and to the organizer, well, the organizing committees, we're missing Lilia, but apart from that, we have all parts of it on stage. But thank you so much for organizing this and bringing us together. The second panel is to focus on justice for Ukraine and for the international order. As an international lawyer, I would perhaps say that justice and international law does not always go very well hand in hand. It's not always something we manage to take care of in a good and proper manner. But we're at least going to try to dive a little bit into it. And justice comes in very many forms. Now, one of those forms who has gained much attention in regard of the atrocities in Ukraine is justice in the form of prosecution of crimes. And since we have an hour, we're predominantly going to stay in that track and talk about war crimes and the prosecution of different forms of crimes that can be committed in an armed conflict. To do this, we're sort of going to try to divide it in two. We're going to do one section first up here where we're going to discuss what constitutes the crimes and how are they important. And then we're going to try to do one section on, well, the problem of prosecuting. Because in international law, and then we're going to talk about how that transfers into domestic Ukrainian law also, there's a very clear divide. There's one thing to have a right or to have a crime, and there's a wholly different matter of actually getting it before a court and getting it prosecuted is something, is an international or a national wrong. And then we're also going to try to make time at the end to get time for some interaction with the audience. So please do sharpen your pencil and note down the questions that comes up for you. But I thought perhaps we should then start with the international criminal law. There's a law that applies between states in an armed conflict. Of course, Russia has a differentiating view on whether this is an armed conflict as such or not. I don't think we're going to go into that. I think we're just going to state that for all practical purposes, there isn't really any doubt. And the panel can feel free to correct me on this afterwards, but that would be my view, that this is an international armed conflict. And so the law of international armed conflict is applicable. But now in relation to that, we often talk about also war crimes and crimes against humanity. And Artem, you're working on the national aspect of prosecuting these war crimes. But maybe you could start us off by what are war crimes, crimes against humanity, and then draw us into how this is implemented into the Ukrainians there.
Okay, thank you for the question. So I can start the concept and the idea to somehow prohibit and limit the consequences of armed conflict can trace back for centuries, but the idea and concept of let's say modern understanding of war crimes and crimes against humanity started in the ending of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. The first document of this international humanitarian law, also known as law of armed conflict, can be traced by the Hague Conventions and later by the Geneva Conventions, two main blocks of international law in this field. And now it's also established the International Criminal Court, which established by the Rome Statute, which is ratified by many and most of European countries and other countries around the world. Unfortunately, Ukraine signed it but not ratified yet, which is a big problem, legal issue in the prosecution of war crimes in the current war between Russia and Ukraine. And yeah, Ukrainian criminal code consists the legal norm about the war crimes, but in a very specific manner, which is not fully corresponds with the international practice and the international conventions. Yeah, so currently I can recall that since the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, it was the Ukrainian Office of the General Prosecutor registered more than 120,000 war crime cases already, which is a huge amount. It's a huge workload on the Ukrainian judiciary. Yeah, and probably it will take a lot of time to prosecute them all, decades. And obviously, probably in that case, we need to call for some international support in the prosecution of war crimes in Ukraine. So we have no definition about the crimes against humanity in the proper modern understanding of it in international criminal code, international criminal law. So yeah, I also want to recall about the how many people died and injured during the conflict since the 24th February 2022. According to the UN statistics, more than 10,000 people died already. 500 of them is children. And yeah, we need to raise these questions in both legal and institutional issues about the prosecution of war crimes in Ukraine, to bring the justice and to bring justice also for the victims of this war, and bring the perpetrators to the accountability for the atrocity they committed.
Forgot to say, but the more we can make this an organic discussion between the panel, the better. So if you want to tag on, please do. But Tadej, moving from that, we have sort of recognized internationally that we can work with these three separate sorts of crime, the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that Artem mentioned for us. But there is also this third, more elusive category of the crime of aggression. Could you place that into the picture for us?
Yes, the crime of aggression, or the crimes against peace, as it was called, was really established as part of international law through the Nuremberg process and judgment, and also trials at Tokyo. So essentially, it is the same crime that we have today, although we today talk about the crime of aggression. As we have had other tribunals, other international tribunals, prosecuting crimes against humanity, war crimes, and even genocide cases, we do not have had any prosecution of the crime of aggression since Nuremberg. But it is one of the 4 crimes in the Rome Statute that was enacted in 1998. But as compared to the 3 other crimes, the crime of aggression was not defined in the Rome Statute at the time, because there was a discussion, and there was some powerful states, including the United States, that were actually opposed to having the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute in the first place. So what happened then was a compromise solution. The crime was mentioned, not defined, and then it would have to later on to define the crime. And that happened in 2010 at Kampala. But again, there was a compromise solution. You got the definition of a crime, which today is in the Rome Statute, Article 8 bis. But you also got some special rules on jurisdiction for this particular crime, which makes it almost impossible to prosecute in practice. So, and the crime itself, yes, it's about a major attack on another country. That's the essence of it. In the Rome Statute, one distinguishes between the aggressive acts and the crime of aggression. So there are certain acts that are enumerated, like invasion, armed attack, occupation, annexation of a territory. These are blockade. Could also be an act of aggression, but for it to be a crime of aggression, these acts have to be of a certain gravity. Has to be a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations.
So, and that, I suppose that would also mean that there are differences here in that war crimes can be committed by the individual soldier, whereas the crime of aggression is sort of a top-level crime that is sort of reserved for the decision maker.
Yeah, that's a very important point. For this particular crime, we call it a so-called leadership crime. It doesn't mean that other persons cannot, in theory, not be considered accountable as well. But basically, it is the military and political top leaders that could be responsible. So that's different as compared to the other crimes. What is also interesting about the crime of aggression in relation to Ukraine, for instance, is that this crime covers all the acts. So in the crime of aggression in Ukraine covers all the acts. They are illegal, but they doesn't necessarily constitute also war crimes. But they fall under, all the acts fall under the crime of aggression if this crime, the conditions are fulfilled.
And you have, well, both the academic, but also the more practical knowledge of working at the international level and with the approach to international crimes. Could you perhaps take us into why prosecuting or finding and being able to prosecute war crimes and crimes of aggression are so important?
Yes, sure. And I will be speaking about the situation in Ukraine specifically, and not only about prosecuting atrocity crimes, but also ensuring accountability of Russia for violating its obligations under international law. So I think I would like to present 3 points. And the first point is that accountability and justice is very important for victims of these crimes. So the war in Ukraine and this unlawful, unprovoked act of aggression has inflicted a very profound sense of injustice on Ukrainian people. And I think to redress the grievances and the trauma inflicted by the war on Ukraine, it's very important to provide people with justice. And you can see in one of the first war crime trials that was taking place in Ukraine, the victim of the crime who lost her husband, who was killed by the Russian soldier, she was present in the trial, and you could see that she was able to confront the perpetrator, who said that, I'm sorry. And that act, I think, is a very profound act of some kind of closure to people who have lost their loved ones and have lost a lot in this war. A more practical side of it, providing justice to victims, is providing reparations. And that's a bit more complex and difficult and challenging question, because International Criminal Court, about which we'll talk a little bit later, can provide reparations, but only after having convicted the person, right? So that's the stage that comes only after convicting the person. And now the persons charged are Putin and his Human Rights Commissioner, and who knows when we will see them in the dock at the ICC and will reach that stage of the conviction. So I think that as currently the international justice mechanisms are constructed, it can be difficult to gain reparations from victims from them. So here, I think Ukraine and international community have to find a workable solution for repairing without delay the harm that was inflicted on people, providing this practical side of justice to the people. And the acting ambassador of Ukraine has mentioned already the register for damage caused by the Russian aggression is one step towards that. Another aspect of it is actually the protection of fundamental norms of international law and deterrence of future such wars and aggressions. And I think you can see from how Ukraine has approached the situation, Ukraine has used international law mechanisms very actively since 2014. And I think it shows that Ukraine is actually has a belief in international law, and that it will protect it, or at least puts a lot of hope into international law. And I think international law is very important for states like Ukraine and states like Norway, states that are located and have to deal with a neighbor that is much bigger and is much more powerful. And I think a lot of states that are in these situations, and especially smaller states, are interested in having an international law that works. And another question is the deterrence. Of course, it's very difficult to empirically establish whether international law and prosecution of international crimes has a deterrent effect. But another question that I put to myself also in this situation, what would be the signal, or what would be the consequences of not prosecuting these war crimes, or not holding Russia responsible for the act of aggression? We saw consequences of not reacting strongly enough to Russia's invasion in 2014, and the fact that Russia actually dared to escalate the war in 2022 is the consequence of that impunity. And in my opinion, looking at the world now, given that Russia has been, how the Russia was able to conduct this war in 2 years, full-scale invasion, I think that the fact that Israel acts without restraint in Palestine, or that Venezuela is amassing forces on the borders of Guyana, is also partly already the consequence of lack of impunity and the fact that these norms are not able to perhaps restrain the aggressor as much as we would want to. And then my third point is counting Russia's narratives, because this war and Russia's invasion into Ukraine is based on it's based on ideology developed by Putin. It's based on a narrative on disinformation. And whom the states or different people in the world choose to support in this battle is also very much depends on different narratives. And I think the judicial processes have the potential of establishing who is right at least, or who is not, or who is wrong, because of course it's not always that judicial process can result in absolute truth, because they use a different standard beyond reasonable doubt. So something that has not been proven in the court doesn't mean that it didn't happen. But anyways, I think that judicial processes that use rigorous examination of evidence have the potential of actually, telling us who is wrong and who is right in the situation. And one very good example is a decision by the European Court of Human Rights in the case Ukraine and the Netherlands versus Russia, where they actually, after so many years, said clearly the so-called separatist operations, separatist groups in the eastern Ukraine, this is not a genuine separatist movement. This is an operation that was financed, supported, politically managed, created basically by Russia. And that was, I think, a very important point to make, given that the international community and a lot of people abroad didn't really know what has been happening in Donbass for the last 8-10 years.
And in that, there is also the enormously important interplay between law and politics at this level now. The ruling you mentioned now, and also the ruling on provisional measures from the ICJ in the genocide case, where they concluded that Russia had to withdraw to the borders of 24th of February 2 years ago, was also seminal in sort of making the argument to states that weren't too interested, it would seem to me, to say that you need to support the further UN General Assembly resolutions because there's a clear statement from the court here. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. And actually, the fact that, Russia said that Ukraine was committing genocide in eastern Ukraine in 2022, and that's why we have to protect those people. And then in eastern Ukraine, and then Ukraine comes to the court, and it's the hearing on the 16th of March 2022, so a couple of weeks after the full-scale invasion, comes to the court with its legal team and says, look at the evidence. There are no evidence that indicate that any kind of persecution or any kind of atrocities are being committed. Look at the reports of international organizations. There are no reports of increase in deaths and whatever. So I think that the fact that the court said in its provisional measures, there are no evidence that Russia's claims about genocide committed by Ukraine allegedly have any ground. There is no evidence of that. And I think that was also very important to telling the world what is happening there and using that to counter Russian narratives and disinformation.
Going from that and taking us back into the Ukraine, Artem, could you talk to us a little bit about how war crimes are being prosecuted within the Ukrainian framework for dealing with this nationally?
Okay, thank you for the question. So I think that, as I mentioned before, that it's a huge amount of cases which already committed, war crimes committed and registered by Ukrainian prosecutors, 120,000 cases already. And unfortunately, according to the official data statistics, we have only really few, taking into consideration the full amount of cases committed. We have only a few final verdicts and judgments already delivered against the Russian soldiers, around 50. So yeah, we can expect that it takes a lot of time to prosecute them all. So as I mentioned before, also that Ukrainian criminal code didn't fully implement the modern international standards of war crimes. So Ukrainian parliament had 2 attempts to ratify Rome Statute because we signed it back 20 years ago, but we haven't ratified it yet. And Ukrainian parliament made 2 attempts to ratify it, but unfortunately, it was not successful. And now we use our national criminal framework to prosecute war crimes with reference to Geneva Conventions as grave breaches of Geneva Conventions and other serious violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. And our prosecutors, after some war crime committed in Ukraine, for example, targeting civilian infrastructure, the register opened the case, and then prosecution initiated. But according to the official data and open sources about the verdicts, a lot of cases which was already delivered judgments, they was trialed in absentia, which means the Russian criminals was not present at the court. And really few of them connected with the willful killing, with the murder of civilians. But the impact of Russian invasion in terms of war crimes committed is huge and impressive. And a lot of non-governmental organizations, international partners help Ukrainian prosecutors, police and other investigator bodies to prosecute, to collect evidence. We have also one more issue which arises, that is ongoing conflict. So sometimes, for example, if we capture the Russian troops, Russian soldier, and he witnessed his witness of some war crimes. So sometimes we can exchange this soldier to get our Ukrainian prisoners of war from Russian side. So it also happened already during the first trials, which was actually, as Gayana mentioned, in early, like in spring 2022, a few witnesses was exchanged like a prisoners of war. So it's make even more difficult and more complicated to prosecute, because a lot of we can't physically control these soldiers or criminals. Sometimes even if we can control it, but we have 2 options. What should we do? Prosecute them or try to get our people back, our soldiers back to Ukraine, or prisoners of war in Russia. So it's a lot of legal issues, and I think both institutional capacity and a lot of not only civilian infrastructure was extensively targeted by Russian missiles attack, artillery as well, but also a lot of governmental buildings, courts was destroyed or damaged. But still, it's very good point that Ukrainian justice still is operating now, even during these tough times. And it's it's an indicator and a signal that's of resilience of Ukrainian nation, that we want to prosecute war crimes now by our capacity, which we have now. But obviously the international support, international advisory support, financial, some maybe international stakeholders can also raise the question about the ratification of Rome Statute to make it easier and more up-to-date understanding of war crimes in Ukraine, because it's also mentioned in the association agreement with EU that we have to ratify the Rome Statute. It's an obligation since association back to 2014. So I hope that international community, both academia and stakeholders, policymakers, can contribute to this topic and propose their ways to resolve these issues which we have now, and also raise this question about the ratification of Rome Statute in Ukraine, which is, in my personal opinion, and I think my co-panelists will agree with me, that it's very, very crucial issue now, that we can bring Russian war criminals to justice, more efficiency, let's say easy, and in a way with the most the modern international law standards. Yeah.
And that's the national side of it. And then, Guyana, if you could take us up to the international level, how are the prosecuting mechanisms at that level?
So we have International Criminal Court, a court that is based in The Hague since 2002. And we've already mentioned that it has a jurisdiction to prosecute certain crimes, as war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and in principle crime of aggression, but not in the situation of Ukraine. The court has been actually engaged with the situation in Ukraine since 2015. So the situation has been under the preliminary examination of the prosecutor of the ICC since 2015. And preliminary examination is a stage where the prosecutor collects information about what is happening in the country in order to decide whether he or she will open the investigation in the case. And only the full-scale invasion of Russia in 2022 prompted the prosecutor to move to the investigation stage. And then there was also a referral from 43 member states of the Rome Statute to support that move. A year later, in 2023, the prosecutor issued his first arrest warrants against Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, Volobelova. And there was one charge, so they were suspected of having committed this crime of unlawfully deporting or unlawfully transferring Ukrainian children from the occupied territory to the territory of Russia. And why the prosecutor chose this crime, to charge this crime? I think because there were evidence of that, because that was part of official policy of Russia, and the prosecutor could then establish the connection between what was happening on the ground and the responsibility of Putin and Volobelova, who clearly were aware and supported this policy of transferring Ukrainian children. And another reason, I think, is that because children are very vulnerable categories of victims, and their transfer to Russia and their forceful integration into Russian society can cause them irreparable damage, in the sense that their connection with their native countries, their family, is destroyed. This is not the only, I think this is not the only crime that will be in the case against Putin, and it's also possible to speculate that perhaps the list of the suspects will be extended by the prosecutor. And usually the ICC focuses on prosecuting those people who bear the most responsibility for the crimes. And in the conception of the Rome Statute of the ICC, these are the people who are masterminds, not those who actually commit the crimes with their own hands on the ground, but those who plan, who order, who direct the commission of the crimes through other people. So I think my opinion is that perhaps the other crimes against the integrity of the person, like arbitrary executions that we saw happening in the occupied territories in the Kiev region, in Kharkiv region, and torture that has now been said by the UN Special Rapporteur and the UN International Commission on Fire on Ukraine to have systematic and widespread features will also, I think, be added to the list of crimes. The prosecutor has earlier said that maybe that they were also looking at these crimes of destruction of energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. And I think a more challenging issue, because energy infrastructure can also be in certain circumstances military objective whose destruction is allowed under international humanitarian law. But nonetheless, in the situation of Ukraine, there are good grounds to believe that what Russia has been doing to energy infrastructure was actually attempting to terrorize the civilian population and kind of to create hardship for the civilian population in Ukraine rather than to target military objectives.
Because that touches on to something important that Artem brought up, the actual securing the evidence. How difficult is that for the international court to do, and what kind of resources do they have to do that?
They have an office now in Ukraine, and they had a team of more than 40, I think, investigators working on the ground. And I think the cooperation between the Office of the Prosecutor and the Ukrainian authorities is quite good. Ukraine has always been interested in having the ICC prosecute those crimes. And I think the cooperation from the state is actually one of the conditions for the success of the ICC, because it very much depends on the access to the ground that the state gives the ICC. So I think that is that facilitates the work of the ICC on the ground on Ukraine, the willingness of Ukrainian authority to see the progress in these cases.
Yeah, Terje.
Yeah, just a comment on the prosecution against Putin for the war crimes so far, because there is also this kind of linkages between the crimes. So, for instance, I argued in an article 2 years ago that one way that to some extent could be helpful. Kind of a prosecution of the crime of aggression would be to take this crime into account when investigating and prosecuting other crimes. And I also argued this at the conference a year ago. And when the ICC then finally made the arrest warrant, it was noted by the prosecutor and also by the pretrial chamber that this war crime was committed in the context of an aggression. So thus adding to the gravity of the crime, and this might be possible to take into account at all stages, and finally, if you get to the sentencing stage at some point. So that would be, I mean, it wouldn't be enough, but it would be some kind of linking war crimes to the crime of aggression. But the problem is, of course, that the crime of aggression covers nearly everything. It's the crime against the whole Ukraine and the Ukrainian population. And if you do not have any prosecution of the most responsible persons for that large crime, to some extent, at least at the international level, that would be a failure. So I'm not sure if we'll go more into that, but of course there has been a lot of discussions at the international level. How could we do this outside of the ICC, since it's not possible to have a crime of aggression case because of the jurisdictional limitations. And one possibility that has been discussed, what about amending these particular jurisdictional limits? That is a long process, probably, and a difficult one. And what about other alternatives? Could a court be established through an agreement with the EU, maybe even with the Council of Europe? Could a group of states get together and establish a treaty like they did at Nuremberg? Or what many people would prefer, I think, to have an agreement between the UN and Ukraine upon a majority resolution by the General Assembly. So all these options are on the table. They have been discussed for quite a long time. There is an international working group consisting of 44 states. Norway is one of the states participating in the group. And I think they have had 6 meetings and the 7th meeting coming up soon. But from what we heard, there hasn't been real progress in the sense that the states have been able to agree on one particular solutions. The Ukraine, of course, they want a real international tribunal established through the UN. And I personally personally think that that's absolutely the best option. And it's not really about the legal problems involved, because it's more about the political choices that have to be made, and not at least the sufficient political will to do it. And then it has turned out that some major states do not want really such an international tribunal.
Yeah, because that's, I think that, would it be fair to sort of make the rather, perhaps in some senses, the bold statement, but would it be fair to make the statement that prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity, that is sort of accepted both internationally and also accepted that is done nationally, but that again, prosecuting the crime of aggression as a separate crime is really today a political question that requires significant international political will to get done. Would that be a fair statement of the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no secret really who the states are who are against having this real international tribunal. That's the United States, and the UK, Germany. France was about actually to support the international tribunal, but then I think they changed their mind. So they are also in line with these major powers. So what they are suggesting is, why not have the prosecution of the war, the crime against aggression within the Ukrainian legal system, which is difficult, and I'm sure you can explain why that is difficult and not really desirable from the Ukrainian point of view.
Yeah, we both with our Ukrainian prosecutors start investigation. We call this like magistral case in Ukraine, which includes not only the war crimes which we already discussed, but also crime aggression war. Let's say crime of aggression war, which is like it's stated in our Ukrainian National Criminal Code. Currently, I think it's around 1,200 people in this list of people who accused for the crime of aggression in Ukraine. But also it includes always like obvious like Putin, the head of Ministry of Affairs, Minister of Defense, Russian Minister of Defense, etc. But yeah, the question which also Terje started and discussed before, it's a really difficult and tough task because even inside the Ukrainian legal system, I think to bring the head of state or the top leadership, the organizers like and initiators of this war, it's really difficult and tough, both I think internationally and domestically. Yeah, so.
There was also suggestion from the states that because Ukraine, one of the reasons Ukraine wants an international tribunal is that Ukrainians feel that this is not just a local conflict, and Katarina Zarembo said she put it very well, it's a local dimension of global conflict. And Ukrainians feel that this is not just our business to deal with the accountability for this act of war that actually has consequences far beyond Ukrainian borders. It's for the international community also to deal with the accountability issue. And another legal concern prosecuting in the domestic court is that an acting head of state, acting minister of foreign affairs, or acting prime minister, they have immunity from the prosecution in a domestic court of a foreign state. And one can make a very good argument that such immunity does not apply before international criminal court, even though until recently that has also been a disputable position. But given that the ICC issued the arrest warrant against Putin, we can see that the issue is more or less settled now, although you can also debate what is an international court, criminal court. But another actually suggestion from the countries that you, Terje, mentioned was to have the prosecution in a domestic court system of another state, not Ukrainian, maybe like the Netherlands, for example, that would not, of course, help with the issue of immunity. And the US say, well, but Putin is not going to be prosecuted since while he is an acting president anyway. So we will have to wait until his position changes, etc. So there are a lot of debates here. And like you say, they are colored. The state's positions are very much colored by their political interests. But I think earlier I talked about the fundamental norms of international law and making them workable. And I think applying them on principled ground, regardless of what happened before or what we did not do before. We didn't bring to responsibility leaders of states for invasion of Iraq, etc. That shouldn't that shouldn't play a role here if a state acts principally, because now the importance for the future of the world is what kind of world we want, right? Do we want for these norms to work in the future? And do we want to avoid similar wars in future? And if we want to, then we have to act on the principled manner.
We're going to open for the audience, but there's one aspect I just wanted to cover more briefly before we can do that. Guyana, you kept us on page by saying that criminal responsibility here is one thing, but there's also the question of reparations. And anyone who has seen the pictures coming out of Ukraine have seen the more or less total destruction of many, many cities. There are homes that are destroyed. There is infrastructure that is destroyed. You mentioned the energy sector. And the reparations issue is not only is then hugely important. And the acting ambassador also mentioned this on the freezing of funds in Europe and how these could be made available for rebuilding in Ukraine. How does a reparations case between the Ukraine and Russia look in the aftermath of the war? What international mechanisms you have to deal with state reparations and down to individuals?
I think it will be difficult to have an interstate case like judicial mechanism here, because now for many reasons the door at the International Court of Justice is closed, and I'm not going to go in a lot of details there, but basically Ukraine doesn't have a claim that can give it reparations before the International Court of Justice anymore. And the ambassador earlier mentioned that Russia was found to violate 2 international conventions recently, but the court did not award any reparations. So the statement of violation was considered enough. One court that can examine reparations here is European Court of Human Rights, that has many for interstate cases between Ukraine and Russia. And I think there you can have a judicial process for reparations, even though it remains to be seen how the court deals with this complex issue of application of human rights instrument in time of war and to active hostilities more precisely. But then we also, so basically my opinion is that we need some kind of other mechanism that is developed for this. It can be a reparation commission, it can be the damage, for register for damage that is now based, like grounded in the Council of Europe, for example. But of course, another issue is how do you enforce that against Russia? And as you mentioned, using the frozen accounts of Russian state central bank is one issue that has a lot of legal complexities there too, but also closely related to the political will of the states.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another possibility, not for prosecution, but maybe for serving some kind of justice, and also establishing the common narrative that is also very important about this whole aggression. And that could be for the Ukraine to go to the International Court of Justice, or you have to go through the General Assembly to ask for an advisory opinion on the crime of aggression and its consequences. That would be possible. It would not be directly binding on Russia, but still it would establish what the law is, which is also very important.
But I think the law is pretty clear here. That there is no dispute that Russia is committing an act of aggression. The question is, where do we find a suitable forum for adjudicating the claims? And I think also, I mentioned that there is no existing judicial mechanism, but I think an international tribunal for crime of aggression can be such mechanism where you can consider the whole scale of the damage caused to Ukraine, because, like you said, it covers all the unlawful acts committed by Russia in Ukraine. And to add here that it's not only Ukrainian civilians and members of armed forces who are victims here, it's also the Russian armed forces who are Russian people who are sent to die in this war that doesn't bring anything to that society. So I think Russian society has also to be interested in this, in supporting these initiatives and discussing these issues.
Absolutely, I fully agree. It's just that, I mean, it could be, I still think it could be useful, because you would also then, if you ask the right questions to the court, you can have clarification with regard to third states' obligations in this situation, which is also because there are some states supporting Russia actually and being more or less complicit in the crime. So a clarification of the responsibility of third states in a situation with a crime of aggression, I think that could be quite useful. But let's discuss it later.
I think we're going to open for questions from the audience. I would ask you to please state your names and keep questions brief if we can. At front.
Yes, Bjarte Bjørsvik, International Committee of the Green Party, MDG. Thank you for your talks. Very good. I follow all of it more or less. I'm not a lawyer, but I wonder about the last part here, the economic part of it. The war of aggression on all kinds of crimes that Russia has committed. Ukraine needs help now, because it's sometimes talk about reparations after the war or something, which we don't know if or when will happen. Are there, within the legal frameworks now, I say frameworks as both the international and national, potentially Swiss banks, for instance, any way to take hold of these Russian funds, which are substantial, like a couple of $100 billion or something in exchange for resources? Or are there options within the Rome statutes to change them somehow, with or without the tribunal, that you see could be more easily done? Probably not easy, but more easily.
Reflect.
Let's do two together.
Yes, my name is Gunnar Eklov Slydal. I'm with the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. So two short and very easy questions. The first one is the accountability of businesses. It links a little bit to what we are going to talk about after the lunch break. Do you see any avenues that could hold businesses accountable for their complicity when they are providing weapons and components for weapons to the Russian army? So this is the one. The other one is a little bit more legally oriented. There is a basic principle in the Rome Statutes of complementarity. And there are a few international lawyers who say ICC is doing way too much in Ukraine because the Ukrainian judiciary is both willing and able to prosecute themselves. What would be your answer to that?
You want to start with any of these two?
I can take the last question about the complementarity. Ukrainian judiciary is willing to prosecute the crimes, but whether they are able to do so in all the circumstances is not always the case. So taking hold of people, one of the definition of inability to prosecute in the practice of the ICC is not having in custody the suspected person. And that comes from the ICC practice in Libya cases. So in that sense, you can say that Ukrainian domestic system is not able to prosecute the leadership of Russia, whereas the ICC having the possibility and having the possibility to issue arrest warrant and being international criminal court that is able to also overcome immunity has the ability to do so. But I think the ICC's role is going to be quite limited in the sense that they will have several cases where they prosecute individuals in the higher positions, whereas most of the cases will be examined in domestic courts in Ukraine anyway.
Maybe I can try to answer the question on liability for corporations. The Rome Statute is limited to natural persons, so only natural persons can be prosecuted before the ICC. So for that reason, you need to link the liability of a corporate leader to the crime, and that could be possible. That was done already at Nuremberg. The ICC has not had any such cases yet, but that might happen. And yes.
So now you want to tackle the funds question.
I think it would be discussed in the future panels.
Yeah.
So don't just break the panel, just hold the question.
I can say something. I think that the legal framework for one of the arguments that is proposed for seizing the assets of Russian central bank is that they can be used as a countermeasures. And countermeasure in international law is an act that the state does that in essence is a violation of its obligations, in this sense, obligation to respect the immunity of the funds of the state. But you do it in order to prompt the state to comply with its obligations under international law, so to stop the act of aggression. And that's one of the avenues of one of the arguments for the use of funds. But I think you are right in the sense that reparations are needed now. And that's why I said that the responsibility is on Ukraine now, together with other countries, to develop this system for the reparations now that can be provided for people that need it now.
Daniel Budenka, I'd like to take down the discussion from the level of state responsibility and key decision makers to the level of executors. In Norway right now, mercenary from the Wagner group is hiding, and he has been granted temporary residence with the decision not to extradite him to Ukraine or to Russia for prosecution of the war crimes. Being a mercenary, he made a willful and deliberate decision to join the war. So I'm curious about two questions here. First one is whether these decisions are more of political equilibristics, considering that Norway had previously cases of extraditing people to Afghanistan wanted by Taliban. And the second question is inspired by the discussion of repercussions of not prosecuting states for criminal offenses. So I'm wondering whether a case of not prosecuting an offense done by a mercenary and letting him will have or could have repercussions that you can envision. Thank you.
Last one, yes, prosecutions can take place in Norway with regard to war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine if the alleged perpetrator is residing in Norway. So that's possible, and I think the Kripos, the Norwegian Special Police, are investigating such cases. There has been articles in the newspapers that I think more than 4,000 Ukrainian refugees have come forward to the Kripos with information as witnesses about war crimes. But in that case, you have to, the person, the last perpetrator has to be present in Norway, and that could be, of course, with a person from the Wagner Group. So Kripos could investigate that. With regard to extradition, you know, I think the case we are talking about, it's this particular person has been written about in the newspapers. So he applied for asylum in Norway, and then he goes through the ordinary asylum process, and in principle he could be then provided with protection against being returned to Russia. And then if there is an extradition request by Ukraine, that would have to be considered. In that case, I think there would be no fear of persecution, but it could be a question of whether he would receive sufficient fair trials. In principle, that question could be raised by his lawyer, I think. But I'm not sure that there has been actually a...
They have not extradition batch between here with temporary residents. The decision was not to provide him asylum as he's a war criminal. Yet, extradition as active in danger.
Yeah, exactly, because in the asylum procedure, he could be excluded from refugee status because of his own acts. But then if there is the risk of ill treatment in Russia, he would then still have a limited kind of residence permit in Norway that can be renewed every 6 months. And he would have limited rights in Norway.
I think we've already sort of ventured into lunch. So no. So, but I think I'm going to cut us off there and say thank you so much to the panelists for a very educational and interesting panel. And again, thank you to the organizers for offering the opportunity to come together and discuss these important matters.
The organizing committee who has invited me to moderate the third panel of today, which has been very interesting so far. This panel is on reparations for Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. And we have touched upon these topics a little bit previously. So my aim is to follow up on some of the things that has already been mentioned. So in the previous panel, we heard primarily about using judicial processes as a means of seeking justice and providing accountability for the act of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Other means of seeking justice might be applying sanctions against the aggressor, and something that also was touched upon in the previous panel, providing reparations to the victim through other means, alternative means than judicial processes, so alternative mechanisms for providing reparations. To help us understand the use of sanctions and reparations in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, we have with us Gunnar Eklöve Slidal and Ivan Horodysky. I hope this was an okay pronunciation. So Ivan Horodysky is with us online from Lviv, Ukraine, and I hope you can see him on the screen here. He holds a PhD in law and is the director of the Stanislav Dnistriensky Center for Law and Politics, and is the vice president of the Ukraine Bar Association. One of the focus areas of his center is war reparations for Ukraine, and Ivan will shortly give his introductory remarks on this topic. As you can see, Gunnar Eklöve Slidal is with her physically here in Bergen. Gunnar is the Deputy Secretary General of the Norwegian Helsinki Committee and Director of the Coalition of International Criminal Justice. Gunnar has written extensively on topics such as human rights and international criminal law, and has engaged actively on the use of sanctions to promote the strengthening of international law. So I will now give the first word to Ivan and then to Gunnar to give their opening remarks. And after that, I will open the floor for questions quite immediately after their presentations. So Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and first of all, I would like to thank to the Bergen University, to the so esteemed audience for holding these events devoted to the anniversary of Russian aggression against Ukraine. 2 years after, and we don't know how many time ahead, this topic of compensation, responsibility, many other aspects will be contemporary for Ukraine. Me personally and Nistiansky Center, UBA, many other institutions and experts in Ukraine are working and cooperating on issue of reparations for Ukraine and Ukrainians. Currently, we don't know the exact amount and numbers of the losses and damages inflicted by the Russian aggression. The highest number, which was announced by the Ukrainian Prime Minister, was around 1 trillion of US dollars. I'm not sure this is a correct number, but definitely it goes about hundreds of billions. And every day, every victim and every strike makes these numbers much more higher. Ukraine takes proactive role in the reparations process starting from spring 2022. In May 2022, our president issued a decree which established a special working group on establishment of international compensation mechanism. This group includes government officials and international, not Ukrainian, but international legal experts who are working in the field of reparations. Currently, the main idea and vision of the compensation mechanism is that it should consist of 3 main elements. It's register of damage, which had been already created last May. It is compensation fund, and it is compensation commission. Such mechanisms is much similar to Iraqi and Kuwait reparation process, excluding one major moment. In case of Iraq, we had a voluntary agreement to pay compensation, and there was a mechanism. It was not perfect, but this was a fees from export of oil and oil products. And this financing of the compensation had taken a very long time, but still it worked. In case of Ukraine, in case of Russia, we obviously won't have a voluntary agreement to pay compensation. It's politically desired scenario, and G7, European Union, many other declarations and statements, they confirm that the Russian assets will be frozen till the moment when Russia pays reparations. So this is a proof that international community still wants Russia to pay to recognize its guilt and to pay. In Ukraine, we doubt it will happen, and that's why we are promoting main idea of confiscating of Russian assets which are currently frozen in many jurisdictions, mainly in the European Union and mainly in Belgium. Already this year, European Union has adopted certain steps toward using of these assets for aid to Ukraine. It's not a question of confiscation, at least for now. It's a question of usage of profits from the assets which are frozen, and it's not a question of compensation, but it's a question of this billions of dollars should be the last number I read was around 4 billions of US dollars should be used for financial aid for Ukraine. This is a very huge step forward because a year and a half ago, there were even no talks and no vision to use this money or to give it to Ukraine. So this is a huge progress. But still, main idea is to confiscate Russian assets, and Ukrainian diplomacy and civil society are promoting and advocating this idea at every possible platform. Without this, and in a situation when there is no voluntary decision and agreement of Russia to pay, the process of compensation will take not even decades, but generations. And if we adhere to the rule of law while saying that we won't confiscate Russian assets, so we should ask us, not we of course, but decision makers should ask themselves one more question. Would it be morally justified that Ukrainians and Ukraine won't get the compensations, and in the same time, Russian assets will be frozen for the decades? This is the main question, because without that, any international compensation mechanism cannot be considered as a success. And this is a brief intro into the general vision of Ukraine and into the program. I can speak much more for an hour about the national practice, about the different international problems with this, but I will be let to later discussion and pass a word to my esteemed colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And we will come back to some of the questions you raised there. Gunnar, I will give you the word.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm not a lawyer by training, and I'm not an economist by training, but I will say a few things about both the law and economy, about money. As a human rights organization, the Norwegian Helsinki Committee realized some years ago, it was inspired by a British-American businessman, Bill Browder, some of you know him, that human rights violations and violations of international law in general has a lot to do with money, corrupt money. And that was the starting point of our being engaged in using sanctions as a tool to fight impunity for very serious violations of human rights, often orchestrated, if not committed by high officials who could do that because they were shielded from any consequences. We saw that in Russia, and the case of Sergei Magnitsky is one. It's emblematic case of this. But if you look at other corrupt authoritarian states, you find the same patterns of abuse by officials. So this is, let's say, corruption and human rights violations hand in hand on the domestic scene. And then we campaigned here in Norway and in the EU. And as you know, in the US, they have always been a step ahead of the Europe when it comes to using sanctions to punish and to correct the behavior of states. Sometimes it's a little bit politicized, but we, of course, advocate that sanctions should be used to underpin and strengthen international law in different situations. So the big change came with the full-scale attack or invasion of Ukraine. There was already established individual sanctions based on human rights in the EU, in the UK, in the US, in Canada. And there were also a long history in the EU to use sanctions to, let's say, correct Lukashenko in Belarus related to Uzbekistan and other situations. But what we saw when the EU decided to use sanctions against Russia was unprecedented. We are now had 12 sanctions package, and probably the 13th will be launched on 24th of February. And these sanctions, they target both individuals with power and influence and who support the illegal war against Russia in different ways. But they're also sectorial. So they include financial sanctions, excluding Russian banks and financial institutions from the international financial system. So it's very hard to transfer money to Russian bank accounts these days, and you cannot use MasterCard or Visa. So it's very comprehensive. What we have been looking more specifically at is export control. And now we come to, I think, a key issue for the war in the Russia's war against Ukraine, because it's a fact that technologically Russia is dependent on Western companies. They don't have the technology themselves to produce very high-tech weapons like missiles, drones, different kinds of vehicles. They really need to import Western IT components, CNC machineries, which you use to produce a lot of advanced stuff that you use in war. To say it a little bit unprecise, I'm not a weapons expert either. But the picture is very clear, and that is, in a way, the good news. Russia cannot wage this war at the level it does in Ukraine without importing advanced equipment from the West. The bad news is that even if this is sanctioned, there is a restriction on, or actually a ban on selling, let's say, IT components, all kinds of equipment that you need to navigate missiles or drones, and also trucks, which you use to transport military equipment to the battlefield. There are more than 3,000 different items which are sanctioned by the US and the EU and the broader sanction coalition. There is 38 countries, including Norway. In spite of these sanctions, we see in different ways that Russia is still able to buy a lot of this stuff. And that is very bad for Ukraine, because on the battlefield in Ukraine, you find Russian weapons, and you find that inside those weapons, there are a lot of Western-produced items. So this is a problem that we think also has to do with international law, because the war in itself is illegal, as we have heard. It's a war of aggression, and many of these weapons are used in committing war crimes. So this is the problem that European politicians, but also and Western politicians, and also Western companies has to look into, because it can be illegal. They can have even a criminal liability for selling this weapon if they know that these weapons can be used or are used to commit war crimes. So we have a long list, a little bit complicated list of things that should be done to improve sanctions. It's not hopeless. Some of the sanctions are working, but there is a lot more to do.
Thank you. I will start with a follow-up question to that. So you say that some of the sanctions are working. And then my question is, what is the ultimate goal of the sanctions? What are the aims, and how do you measure the successfulness?
The statements from the EU, the US, the UK, and other sanctioning countries indicate that the goal with the sanctions is 2-3 points. The first one is to uphold international law. In some of the sanctions, there is a clear reference to international law. So, and that's where we come in. Another very practical thing is to undermine the ability of Russia to wage the war by denying it components which they need. So in a way, providing weapons to Ukraine is one measure of supporting Ukraine. To deny Russia weapons is the other way, and they fit very well together. But if you support Ukraine and then are negligent when it comes to providing weapons, you are in a way fighting against yourself. So to deny Russia the means to wage the war. And the third one is broader and maybe much more controversial. It's to undermine the Russian economy, which of course will hurt not only those who are engaged in the war against Ukraine, but also ordinary Russians. But the reasoning is that in order to influence Russia to stop the war, you also need to undermine their economy.
Yeah, and we will come back to that issue. Ivan, so you mentioned some of the challenges with these international mechanisms, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, and especially how do you actually you mentioned the national practices of confiscating Russian assets, and it has to link to what Gunnar is also talking about. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to start with the most important. I should start at the beginning. I would like to say to Norway and Norwegian people for the support you provide to Ukraine and continue to provide it. We really appreciate it, especially in this probably the darkest hours of this war. Concerning your question, there are a number of problems, number of issues. If we're talking about national practice, this mechanism of confiscation of Russian assets was established and launched in May 2022. It can be discussed, yes, it can be better, but still it's effective and it's working. It envisages a possibility of confiscation of assets, either companies, businesses, real estate, muscle cars, yachts of Russians who are under sanctions because of the support of the Russian aggression. So it's not means that any Russian property or property of Russian citizens is confiscated automatically. No, it means only of those people and entities who are supporting and are connected with Putin, Kremlin, and Russian aggression. Secondly, it envisages a judicial procedure. So Ministry of Justice, on behalf of the government, files a lawsuit to the High Anti-Corruption Court. Why is this court? Because it's a rather new one. It was established in 2019. And currently it is considered as the most reputable and transparent and professional court in Ukraine. And after Ministry of Justice files this lawsuit, High Anti-Corruption Court considers this case. As for mid-February 2024, there was more than 30 decisions on confiscations, and not all were in favor of Ministry of Justice. So still it's adversarial process, and judges are requiring to provide proofs that this property is connected with the Russians, and so on, so on. There is a number of problems, especially mainly which are lying mainly in the field of corporate laws, especially how to, for example, how to confiscate a share of Russians if it is structured on, for example, at Cyprus or at the Netherlands, etc. So in foreign jurisdictions, or in the same time, how to protect third-party owners who are not under sanctions, and so on. These problems are very actively debated in Ukraine. My center is very actively participating in these discussions, but it's what do you need to know about this national mechanism? It's working, and Ukraine is not only demanding confiscates, it's leading by example. And yes, we have this mechanism of confiscation, and it's transparent, so everyone can see, analyze, and discuss. Concerning your second question about the problems of international compensation mechanism, there is one major and big problem, which currently, unfortunately, it's not publicly discussed by the government. The problem is that at Register of Damage will accept only claims of damages which were inflicted, caused on February 24, 2022, that day and after the date. But we have a war which had started in 2014. And during 8 years, a lot of people lost their property, a lot of companies lost profits, businesses, and so on. And we don't know, currently, this international compensation mechanism leaves no space for them. So they won't get compensation under this procedure. This is a problem which will definitely be a social trigger in the longer run. And unfortunately, and here I'm criticizing my government, there is no communication how to deal with it and what was the reason of such approach. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think this also leads me to another question that I have, and that's about the distribution of the reparations. So you mentioned the huge amounts of damage and how much worth of billions that would be, but also the humanitarian suffering, people dead, soldiers and civilians, but also victims of war crimes. So are you now at the stage in these mechanisms where you have you sorted out the mechanisms for distribution and how to prioritize?
Last week, there was an interview of director of the Register of Damage, Markian Klitschkovsky. It was for Ukrainian media. When he uncovered certain ideas, what they are working on. First of all, as far it comes from this interview, the mechanism of distribution and categories of claims will be much similar to Iraq's case of United Nations Compensation Commission. When compensation for murders, for victims of victims of crimes, individuals will be paid first. Businesses will get compensation on the second, third row, etc. Secondly, there will be some new categories. Especially Markian was talking that there will be a new category for international law in general. Just one moment. Missing people. So there will be compensation for missing people. So there will be no, once there is no information what was the fate of the man or woman, so their relatives will be compensated. Thirdly, what's also is very important in such cases as Mariupol or Bakhmut, so cities which were fully destroyed, there will be no additional proofs required. So people would need to prove only one fact, that they have lived in Bakhmut and Mariupol before the war, and then that automatically they will get compensation for the lost property. And firstly, you mentioned soldiers, and Markian said that there definitely won't be any compensation to the soldiers, to veterans, and to families of soldiers. It's a very complicated question. These people are heroes who are fighting for protecting freedoms, but again, international practice doesn't, and in Iraq was the same case. It's not envisaging any possibility or any customary rules that soldiers combatants should get compensation as the same as the victims of conflict. Ukraine currently makes such compensation to families of fallen soldiers, and probably it will continue, but this will be a responsibility of Ukraine. There is no understanding currently about the amounts. I think that's the same as it was in the case of the United Nations Compensation Commission. There will be some fixed amounts which never be enough, of course. And finishing, my main concern as for now, when we are talking about this, it's that the government of Ukraine currently is focused more on the material damages. And it's thinking in terms of reconstruction. So we have destroyed houses, factories, plants, roads, bridges. But people suffering, pain, many other things are not in the primary focus. And as it shows cases of the United States, for example, Japan, these problems can appear when individuals will tell that, look, we have suffered, and these sufferings were not assessed or compensated and require compensation. They can appear in decades after. And that's why one was second my wish to my governments is to make these problems also put these problems into focus. Thank you.
I will now open for questions from the audience, and just one question for you, Gunnar. So you mentioned that the third goal of the sanction was hurting the Russian economy, like broadly speaking. And last week I watched the Norwegian news, and it was raving about the Russian economy, how well it was going, and low unemployment rates, and made me wonder whether the sanctions are working. So what are your thoughts on that?
We cooperate with Norwegian consultancy, Co-Risk, and they have economists, in particular one guy called Alan Bollman. And his take is that on the surface, the Russian economy look much better than it is because they are spending so much on production of weapons and on the war. So it's a wartime economy, but it doesn't think it's sustainable over time. And one of the biggest problems for the Russian state is that it may be running out of dollars and euros, a hard currency. And that can also explain that they have had a drop in import of some Western items. So I think, of course, it's part of Russian propaganda also. So we must be very cautious to buy in what Putin says when he talks about a 3% economic growth. You have to go deeper and see how is that growth constituted.
So any questions from the audience? I think there was maybe one online. And one here? Yeah. Please state your name, and you will get the microphone from Susanna.
Yes, Bjarte Bjørsvik, thank you again. I wonder about what you say is found on the battlefield. High-tech, or at least technological components from the West, put it. They have been made by somebody, and they have been running somehow through a transit country or several. Can you say something more? What are the main companies or producing countries? And also, which are the transit countries? Turkey, for instance, seems to be one of them, maybe Cyprus. And I saw recently that the US was now imposing more sanctions on Turkey and some financial stuff. And the full scale of sanctions hasn't been used yet for different reasons. So what would, apart from that first part, the second part of the question is, what more do you see is the best steps to take regarding sanctions? Which products and which countries in the West, which we have more, so to say, control over?
Well, big questions. For the first one, a lot of Western companies produce products in China. And we see that a lot of export to Russia goes from China. It looks like Chinese export to Russia, but in reality, it's Western produced goods, but they are produced in China by Western high-tech companies. A lot of them are American, some are European. Texas Instruments, German Infineon, Intel, the list is long. And some of these companies actually increased their export to Russia in this way through third countries. You're right about Turkey and United Arab Emirates, but there is also some export directly from the EU countries. And that has to do with another problem, that the border control of export is too weak. if you ask border controllers in Lithuania if they have enough resources to look into what actually goes through their border into Belarus or into Russia, they would say we are in a very bad situation. We don't have the resources needed. And that is a political issue, which I think Lithuanian, but maybe also European decision makers have to look into. And then you have the whole questions of intermediaries. Russians didn't sit silent and watch that they couldn't buy stuff which they needed. So they created a lot of shell companies. Every week there are a lot of new companies with names, and yeah, so it's so hard to have complete overview of what happens, and if this company is a real one or it's set up to circumvent sanctions. That happens a lot. My final comment is that some of the companies who sells a lot to Russia, very big companies with a lot of resources. So our researcher, and it's basically one person with some extra manpower, were able to find a lot of goods imported to Russia by reading Russian custom data, which you can buy. I think it's more difficult to buy it now. So when we go to companies and they say it's too complicated, we don't really buy it. If we can find it out, they with their resources can find it out. So they have to be much careful, not only looking on their supply chain when they produce goods, but also what happens with the goods when they have sold it. If they sell it to a Turkish company, and you know that a lot of circumvention goes through Turkey, of course you have to be suspicious.
Thank you. There is a question in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Stislav. I'm a politics student here at UB. My question was that throughout the last couple of years since the full-scale invasion started, there is an anti-corruption foundation previously led by Mr. Navalny, now late. This organization, now of course non-existent in Russia and operating from abroad, has changed the focus of its investigation rather than more to focus and expose the hypocrisy of the Russian primary war decision makers and individuals responsible for the invasion, responsible for and funding the military-industrial complex, basically exposing that their respective families, wives, children, and others are beneficiaries of the regime, and they actually prefer to stay in the European countries, usually Southern Europe, like Spain, but not always. Sometimes it's Czechia, sometimes it's Italy, sometimes it's United Kingdom, and while exposing, it was lobbying for extending the sanctions put on the high-profile Russian politicians to their respective families, and one could suspect that this process right now is not especially successful. It's going quite slow. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Sometimes the European jurisdictions don't listen to the evidence provided by these investigative organizations such as the Anti-Corruption Foundation. And my question is there a good legal ground to hold responsible not just the decision makers, the politicians responsible for the invasion, but their respective families? Or we would like, or there is some kind of lack of maybe legal or judicial base. Maybe there is lack of interest from the European politician to actually hold responsible these people, and well, first of all, get them out of the European states and send them back to, I don't know, to their country, for example. Thank you.
Do you feel?
So is there a legal base to sanction not only the person who, according to the criteria, committed either serious violations of human rights or grand corruption, but also the families who benefit from, let's say, the corruption or the human rights violations. In some cases, this happened to a certain degree, and many, for instance, children of Russian oligarchs who used to go to school in France or in UK or the US, they don't do that anymore. Not as a direct consequence of being sanctioned themselves, but because their father mostly was sanctioned. To answer in a strict legal way, I don't know how well in a way you have to, at least under the Norwegian sanction law, show that the person sanctions himself have some role in violating international law. So if the person is innocent in that sense, I think it would be very problematic in a legal sense. And in the EU, they actually strengthened, let's say, legal safeguards because they didn't want to have many cases of sanctions persons against the EU and they're winning. That's a very bad way of using sanctions. So I think the tendency, and if you look at the Norwegian bylaws, it's very clear that there should be legal safeguards. So sanctioned persons can also raise a case in the court against being sanctioned, but then the burden of proof is shifted to him mostly.
Unfortunately, time is running out now. I would like to invite Ivan to, if you have a final remark, maybe maximum 2 minutes, if you have anything you would like to add, and then we unfortunately have to finish off.
Yeah, okay, I'll be very briefly. So, starting my part on international compensation mechanism, confiscation, I'm always telling and declaring in my articles and so on that the process of confiscation of assets and reparations to Ukraine will be long, hard, and difficult. So we need to recognize this. It won't be quick. Yes, Ukraine want to expect that it will happen, but very quickly. But it will take, if I will tell 10 years, I think I will be optimist. Still, currently, we have the situation when even the establishment of a register of damages had taken place in very short time. So 1 year, 1 year and a half, even less than 1 year after the start of the process. This is very quick for international law, and it gives a hope that this boost will continue. First of all, it's not for Ukrainians. In Ukraine, it's not a question of money. It's firstly a question of justice. Ukraine requires justice, and Ukrainians need it because we see how our cities are destroyed, how our life is destroyed, and it's very hard. But however war will finish, I doubt that there will be a definition of victory, because with losses every day, and millions of people want to return to Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. That's why sanctions, confiscation, individual criminal responsibility, it's everything about justice and not about vendetta or money or any other. And I'm grateful to Bergen University, to my esteemed colleagues, and to the participants to holding this event, because every such event, when the word is spread on these issues, is a big contribution to the justice for Ukraine. Thank you.
Ivan, thank you very much for attending online from Lviv, and Gunnar, thank you for attending in Bergen, and thank you to the audience.
All right, welcome back after the coffee break. We are ready with the fourth and final panel of the day. The subject now is the war and European cooperation and perhaps European integration. We have a wonderful panel with us today. First, we have Lilia. You all know her, but I will nevertheless seize the opportunity just to say a little bit about Lilia. She came to the University of Bergen a few years ago as an expert in EU copyright law, and she is a brilliant copyright lawyer. And we were really thrilled to recruit her. But for unfortunate reasons that you all know about, she has taken an interest in other fields of the law in recent years, in public international law, EU integration, Ukraine's relationship to the European Union. And she hosted a wonderful conference last year. We have this conference now. She has really, I mean, she's still a copyright lawyer, but now she's so much more. I saw her last year in the University Aula asking really tough questions to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It was impressive. His answers perhaps not so much, but it's really to be so much appreciated. So Lilia is on this final panel. Then we also have two distinguished professors, Christophe Illion and Maria Malkso. Christophe Illion from the University of Oslo, law professor. Maria Malkso, professor of international relations at the Department of Political Science in Copenhagen. But I think they will both excuse me for being a bit briefer when introducing them. They have long and impressive CVs, but anyway, Lilia deserves this special attention. The topic in this final panel could perhaps be summarized. Ukraine and the EU, definitely we will talk about Ukraine and the EU, but we will also talk about Ukraine and NATO. And we will start with that Ukrainian perspective, but then we will perhaps move on to the European or the EU perspective, because this will have consequences for the EU itself. It will perhaps have consequences for NATO, and us being in Norway and Bergen today, this will also have consequences for non-EU member states such as Norway. And so many things have changed within such a short period of time. We have Finland and Sweden in NATO. The fact that Sweden almost there. The fact that we have Sweden almost in NATO is such a change. Nobody saw that coming just before the full-scale invasion, and now it's always taken for granted. Like, okay, that has happened. Let's move on. EU enlargement is suddenly back on the agenda. Incredibly important for Ukraine, but not only for Ukraine. We have Moldova, we have the Balkan states, and so on. There are profound developments in the relationship between NATO and the European Union. Really interesting. I hope we will touch upon that as well. But Lilia, first, let's start with you. What is the status of Ukraine's membership application as we speak, and where do you see it go from here?
Thank you very much. Halvar, first of all, I also have to thank you for this wonderful introduction, and of course to thank University of Bergen and also the Faculty of Law for being so supportive for this conference, but also for all conferences that we organized before. This has been really great, and I'm very thankful to all the participants, of course, and to all the Ukrainian friends who were able to join us today. We had a wonderful panels before, and I think we heard so much about like the problems, right, with prosecuting war crimes, prosecuting crime of aggression, but then also about the reparations and the sanctions and how it's not working so good actually, perhaps as we would like it to be. But I think in the last panel we could also highlight what is actually going maybe in that direction, which Ukrainian nation see it being fit. And Harvard, you asked about the application for the EU membership. Just to update those of you who maybe are not aware of that, on the 5th day of full-scale invasion on 28th of February 2022, Ukraine applied for EU membership. This came perhaps as a shock, not only to international community, but also to Ukrainians. I mean, we're of course in shock anyway, but I would say that this was both a step along the path, but also a very big event for us as a nation. And to start, talking about it being something along the path. Well, Ukraine has been collaborating with the EU since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was already partnership and cooperation agreement signed in 1994. I believe it was the first one with former Soviet country. Actually, Russia had exactly the same. It's not the same in the content agreement, but they also had this agreement after the collapse of Soviet Union. And since then, there were different initiatives and different agreements in place to not only encourage Ukraine moving to the market economy compared to what it was during the Soviet time, but also to promote like rule of law and human rights and the European values. And today in our first panel, we talked about the revolution of dignity. This was really important because what sparked it was actually the refusal of our president to sign an association agreement, which was already mentioned, which was negotiated, or negotiations started already in 2007. However, it was supposed to be signed in 2013, and then the president refused to sign it, and it sparked a revolution, and it was then later on signed in 2014. And this agreement was called as most complex out of those association agreements that EU has with third countries. So it is a really complex one, and it is still in place now. So even though we applied for EU membership 2 years ago, and this process will take some time, of course, we already have something which prepares us also for our membership. But to return back to the question, what is the status now with the application for the membership? The EU responded pretty fast. So already in June 2022, there was a recommendation to make Ukraine this candidate country. And last year, actually, the European Council has recommended to start negotiations on the accession. So we are at the moment when we are waiting then for this accessions negotiations to start. Those normally take some years. I know in Lithuania it was only 3 years, so rather short, but there are countries which are in this process for many, many years. I heard our Vice Minister for European Integration saying that Ukraine would aim to perhaps complete this process within 7 years. I think they said it was a general, but this may be not as important how much time it will actually take, because it will take time. However, it matters a whole lot that we are on the way there, and the Ukrainian government is really dedicated to that. And just this weekend at the Munich Security Conference, there was a whole panel talking about the EU enlargement, and they are not only talking about Ukraine, but also Western Balkans, of course, and Georgia and Moldova. And there was a foreign minister from Lithuania, and he said, well, we do not say that we joined the EU back in 2004. We say that we fought to get back to Europe after being oppressed by Russia for so many years. And I thought that was the brilliant way to put it, because Ukraine is exactly in the same situation, basically fighting to get back on our European track after being oppressed by Russia, and after having them influence also our internal politics for so many years. But since 2014, this has been a clear priority. And since actually 2019, the European integration as well as NATO integration, it is in Ukrainian constitution. So actually the president, the government, and the parliament, they are all tasked with getting us there. And I should also mention NATO, because Ukraine applied for NATO membership in September 2022. So there's also a very important step. Well, since then, I don't think there has been a lot of progress on that, but we heard about security guarantees being signed with Germany, France, and UK just last week, where this might be considered as kind of a step towards that perhaps at some point. But in short, European and North Atlantic integration has been crucial for Ukrainian nation in this year's, especially since 2014.
Thank you, Lilia, for the update. And then Christoph, a very short question for you. Is the EU ready?
No, that's the short answer. And we don't see there are signs that it is taking some time for the EU. And when we say the EU, especially when it comes to enlargement, we have to talk about member states, because even if EU institutions are very engaged in the enlargement process, in preparing both candidates to accede and preparing the Union itself to enlarge, the process is very much in the hands of the member states. But let me rewind a little bit and perhaps in parallel to what Lilia just said. Lilia, I thank you very much, by the way, for having me here today. As you pointed out, the promise of enlargement was a key reaction of the EU and its member states almost immediately after the application was sent. And by all standards, the reaction of the EU was extremely quick. It normally takes several months, if not years, for the EU machinery to process an application. And once the application is processed in the sense that the European Commission would come up with its own opinion about the application, then it will take some time before the member state meeting in council to agree or not with the opinion of the European Commission and to take the first step, which is either to open negotiation or not. That's the basic arrangement. So it was extremely fast. It was so fast that some were already in the EU were talking about a very specific fast-track accession process for Ukraine. But quickly, this idea of having a fast-track accession process for Ukraine was turned down. And rather, what we've seen since then is an attitude which is more the classic attitude of the EU and its member state towards candidate states. A reaffirmation, an underscoring of the classic methodology that needs to be followed in order for a third state, including Ukraine, to enter into the European Union. The classic conditionality, as it's sometimes referred to, namely a whole list of conditions, the famous or infamous Copenhagen criteria, to mention them, that needs to be respected in order for the candidates to proceed and to advance in the accession process. Now, this methodology and this conditionality have been reaffirmed, and Ukraine, as any other candidate, is now subject to the same kind of approach. And then I'm coming to a more sophisticated answer to your question. That methodology, which is legitimate. After all, Ukraine needs to be prepared to enter this very sophisticated organization that is the European Union. That methodology cannot be the only answer. For one, that methodology has not worked for the Western Balkans or the candidates. They have been in the process of getting closer to the European Union for the last 20 years. And we've seen that the enlargement policy by way of EU's influencing and preparing the candidates to accede, that has not worked over the last 20 years. We see several candidates in the Western Balkans region not really moving in the direction of meeting the standards of the European Union. So there is definitely, irrespective of what has happened in Ukraine, there is definitely a need to tweak the methodology which the EU and its member states have articulated over the last 30 years, primarily to prepare the countries from Central and Eastern Europe to enter. Though there may be some common points, starting with the fact that they are candidates for membership, the countries from Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, were in a pretty different position than Ukraine is, let alone the Western Balkans too. And so the methodology will have to be adjusted in order to make it work and in order for the EU and its member state adequately to support Ukraine in order to meet what the EU member states have called the strategic necessity of enlarging. I would add to this, if I may just take another couple of minutes, beyond the need to revamp the methodology, there is also a need, first of all, to boost the member state loyalty towards the strategic decision that they are taking. And there I see a discrepancy between the very almost lyrical language that you find in the European Council conclusions since Ukraine applied, and what the member states are doing or not doing in terms of actually engaging to make that strategic decision a reality on the ground. And I'm not talking only in terms of engaging with Ukraine between now and the moment Ukraine will successfully accede to the European Union as a full-fledged functional member state. But I'm talking also about their loyalty towards the whole process in terms of supporting the EU institutions legally, administratively, financially, to engage with Ukraine to prepare it for ultimate accession. Let me just illustrate by what has happened over the last few months with the government or the prime minister of a member state in particular, declaring out loud that he might take all the veto opportunities that are now appearing along the way to block the process if need be. So that particular prime minister has been part of the process leading to the decision, the strategic decision that Ukraine should become a member state, and at the same time basically saying that he might take advantage of what he counted, and he seems not to be very good at maths. It's not 75, there are 120 at least veto opportunities along the way, that he might take advantage of all these opportunities to block the process. So what I'm saying is that beyond the methodology, which needs to be tweaked and adapted to the particular needs of the Western Balkans and Ukraine, there is also a need for increased loyalty from the member state in order for them to meet the requirement of the very strategic decision that they have taken. Last but not least, and that's connected, we have seen appearing a usual ingredient of any enlargement episode, and that it's the need for the EU to prepare itself, and in particular, and it's really a horrible notion, it needs to prepare its absorption capacity. Don't know whether you've come across that particular notion, but that basically is the suggestion that, yeah, I mean, the candidate states might be very well prepared, but we still have to figure out whether we are prepared internally. And in this context, the usual thing that we hear is that the Union needs to reform its institutions before enlargement can be carried out, before enlargement can take place. And usually reforming institutions mean a treaty revision. And a treaty revision, as you may know, means that all the member states will ultimately need to ratify the revision treaty, and that might entail referenda in various member states. Now, if you think about this particular scenario today, you will be forgiven if you are slightly pessimistic about the chance for the process to be successful. And so rather than engaging in this rhetoric of institutional reform as a sine qua non for enlarging, which some member states will use as an excuse for delaying enlargement as much as possible, with all the ramifications that may have on the ground in Ukraine and in the Western Balkans, the imperative that we have to focus on within the Union is to make sure that the member state not only show loyalty towards the process of enlargement, but that they show loyalty towards the process of European integration. And there's a lot to be done within the European Union. I will refer again to one particular government, which is the one that has been threatening to use the veto opportunities in the enlargement process, which is the government which is at the moment not acting in line with the very rules of the European integration game. And as long as the EU institutions and other member states do not tackle that head-on systematically, then it will be very difficult for the EU really to enlarge. A weakened EU enlarging to further member states will run the risk of really further undermining the European integration process, which ultimately will be a victory for the Kremlin. And that needs to be addressed properly.
Yeah, it seems I will have to work hard to end this on a positive note. which Lilia asked for, but let me just mention that I was in Sweden recently, and we had some meetings with the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they also, of course, see all these problems. And I don't think they have any illusions that it's going to be easy, but they were surprisingly clear that this is Ukraine joining the EU. It's a question of when and not if. And that surprised this Norwegian delegation. Was more like, okay, this is perhaps up in the air, but the Swedes were just crystal clear. This is going to happen. It's just a question of time. And it might take some time. But Maria, we should include cooperation when it comes to defense and security in particular, because of course that's the field of European cooperation that has changed most profoundly. And at least in this country in particular, we're not members of the European Union, but we are members of NATO, it has become more complex. What is NATO doing? What is the EU doing? Are they cooperating? Are they competing? What will this look like in future? Will you help us?
Well, I try. Well, I guess, I mean, what we've seen throughout the day, actually, is that this war certainly has had, besides the horrible things that we see daily, it has had a catalytic effect. And that is the nature of the wars, that there is always something that is also, so to speak, constructive. It pushes things forward. It sort of initiates or instigates certain processes. And it has done so for the EU, which has sort of rediscovered geopolitics, you could say, or gained certain geopolitical awareness. And it has certainly done so for NATO as well, not just when it comes to, being serious about practicing deterrence by delivery of arms, or practicing deterrence at arm's length when helping Ukraine in its fight and indeed existential fight against Russia, but also in terms of reinventing deterrence for itself. Reinventing it in the eastern flank, which would be, and is commonly referred to in the media also as the next front, so to speak, or NATO's new front, because the sort of long and short of it would be to say that after the end of the Cold War, NATO effectively forgot about deterrence or put it away on the shelf because it was supposed to be a nice, brave new world. And now, after decades of being, so to speak, in denial of or about deterrence, it's now practicing deterrence by denial. So in that sense, the catalytic role or the wake-up call of this already pretty long war, and here I particularly appreciate that this is one of the very few seminars actually that has put the right label and the right timeline, up in the title. It's not about, second anniversary, but it is true to the origins of this conflict as an open conflict, as a 10-year-long conflict. So basically, if there was a wake-up call in 2014 in terms of the catalytic moment, you could say that maybe NATO picked the call up a little bit better than the EU did initially. EU perhaps, hit the snooze button first. It has been fast. Both Lilia and Christoph describes how, once the ball was rolling with the EU application on behalf of Ukraine, the candidate status was given surprisingly fast, right? In a way, it was the same with NATO, only that the ball started rolling after 2014 already. There was, when it comes to, doing something in the eastern flank, when it comes to actually first, the Operation Atlantic Resolve, all sorts of showing your presence by exercises, by being there on land and in the sea. And then, establishing these battle groups and so on. So, we've seen this this trend or one of these catalytic results of this conflict in the broader scale of things as NATO rediscovering its sort of historical mission, you could say, and also its center of gravity pretty decisively shifting towards the east. This is also very clear. And obviously, what is also clear there is this dimension that Katarina Zarembo in the morning emphasized, that it is about something much more ambitious on Russia's part. I mean, I would maybe be a little bit more cautious in terms of describing this as a global conflict. I don't think the interests of China and Russia, for instance, are perfectly aligned. They are perhaps aligned in their discontent with the current order, but that doesn't yet, amount to a positive program in terms of what to do about that order. But what is definitely clear is that Russia's ambitions don't pertain, how harsh it might sound, to Ukraine only. They laid very clear proposals, ultimatums on the table in December 21 to NATO, which was about go back to the cage, go back to your pre-1997 borders. Let's remind ourselves that before 1997, none of the Central Eastern European member states were members of NATO. So that's effectively, as blunt a proposal about let us restore our sphere the way we like it, as it gets, really. So in that sense, I think NATO has been, if not before, from that moment definitely onwards, pretty aware of what it is dealing with. But again, that doesn't necessarily do away with this time dimension that Christoph mentioned in the EU context, because we remember also that yes, I mean this pledge that NATO actually gave to Ukraine in 2008 already, which is also considered to be one of these, diplomatic sort of shambles in a way, that they did not give Ukraine and Georgia this membership action plan at the 2008 Bucharest summit. Instead, they put this somewhat lofty promise into the summit communique that they will become members of NATO. Now, this pledge was reiterated in the 2023 Vilnius summit of NATO. But again, it comes with a certain string attached, which says, when allies agree and the conditions are met in this order, which I think is also, of course, interesting, because, of course, the allies have to agree first. And even more so than the EU, because the EU is a distinct beast in terms of its institutional structure. NATO is made of its member states. It's a consensual military alliance, even if it has, some of the political sort of body that has grown into it over time as well. But allies need to agree. All allies need to agree before this can happen. And until the war is raging on, it's unlikely to happen soon, right?
It sounds a lot like the conditions for Norwegian recognition of a Palestinian state, but that's a side remark. If you allow, we will come back to that in a little while. But Lilia, you talked about the importance of the process, so to speak, and Christoph mentioned that the experience from the Western Balkans has not always been the best. EU has been in, these states have been in this process for years, and not much progress, at least for some of them. So can you tell us a little bit more about the process within Ukraine? Because it seems to me that Ukraine is doing a better job in preparing the Ukraine for the EU than the EU is doing for preparing the EU for Ukraine, if I might put it that way. Is that your impression too? Is this, because we all know about the Copenhagen criteria, and at best this will be a constructive process that will help Ukraine, even though it might take some years before you finally there. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, that would be my impression as well. Just to start with a report which was published by Ukrainian government just at the beginning of this month. It was an action plan how to deal with the feedback of European Commission on how we are meeting the accession criteria. And the European Commission report, it was published in December, and now at the beginning of February we already have an action plan how to deal with the issues which were pointed out. And about the time frame, it's starting. Most of the actions are supposed to be taken in 2024. The last date is 2027. So the government tries to address the issues within 3 years. I mean, if that's realistic, that's another question, but this is definitely a priority. So whenever we have any communication from the EU in terms of what is the next step and what are the problems there, it's a government priority to deal with that. But of course, war and actually ensuring safety of our people, it's the most important part at this point, because Katarina Zarembo actually said, well, we have people fighting in trenches from all parts of the society. So we have a lot of lawyers, judges, like all kinds of people there, which we would very much use actually in preparing ourselves for EU membership. So to actually help Ukraine with military means, that's like the #1 priority, because without actually being able to safeguard our territory, but even more important, people, there is no question how we're gonna do it. That's one thing. Resources on the side of Ukraine and actually the specialists there. Another thing is, of course, also the amount of the acquis, so all the illegal acts of the EU, which we need to harmonize with. I'm not sure how much it has grown since 2004, but I can imagine that has been a huge growth. We are talking about 100,000 of pages of the legal acts, which you actually have to analyze and then to see if Ukrainian law is in compliance with that. However, of course, good news are that that EU proposed now this the Ukraine facility. There is already a political agreement on that, and I think European Parliament is going to discuss it next week, which dedicates some funding, which is both in terms of rebuilding and loans and so on, but very important, it also mobilizes experts which can help Ukraine prepare for the accession. So people compare it with this instrument of pre-accession. So there is a will on the side of the EU to actually help with experts. And I, of course, know myself colleagues who have been on both sides. I mean, foreign colleagues helping Ukrainian government with reviewing the laws, as well as preparing the reports for the EU, basically going through the legislation. And one last thing is important to mention, of course, this solidarity within the EU, which Christoph was talking about. Because, for instance, the EU has taken the steps of suspension of import duties quotas for certain products. This is especially grain, for instance. But we have problems on our western border because some member states do not respect these measures taken. So there is also an issue of, I mean, there is a will on the EU side as a whole, but then the loyalty of certain member states to actually follow up on that. So from Ukrainian side, the government is working really hard, and actually the society is pretty much mobilized. So from that perspective, I think the best what could have happened on the 5th day of full-scale invasion was actually that Ukraine applied for the EU membership, because it has given such a boost also for the government and for the people. Now being in the second year of full-scale invasion, well, at least you have this goal you're working towards. And it's also what helps us to carry on despite all the atrocities we talked about today. But definitely on the EU side, and actually on the side of member states, right? There is a lot probably to work on when it comes to actually following up on what has been agreed on.
Just a short remark on import duties on grain, because Norway is a country that we pride ourselves with welcoming refugees from Ukraine, 70,000 at the moment, I think, perhaps even 100,000 by the end of the year. And of course, we do contribute ammunition and some money, but we have not lifted the import duty on grain. Not a very proud moment for the government, but that's just that's unfortunately the fact.
Just to finger on that, what we are witnessing when looking at these discussions about whether or not the blockade on the eastern border of Poland should be lifted, this is a foretaste of the discussions to come, the more profound discussion to come when it comes to several EU policies. To give you a simplistic picture, and this is not specific to the current enlargement process, but it has a particular severity given that Ukraine is a big country. But each and every enlargement has led not only to what I was referring to earlier, namely the need for an institutional reform, either as an excuse to delay the process or as to make sure that the enlargement generally would not upset the functioning of the EU. But well beyond the institutional dimension, there are various policy areas, not to mention the financial dimension of enlargement, which will have to be addressed head on. And we see that appearing here and there, discussions about the EU budget, the cost of new cohesion policy, because I mean, the kind of candidates we're talking about are not necessarily among the richest European countries, and that's an understatement. And that means that if we apply the current cohesion policy mechanisms that the EU has, it will mean quite a substantial increase of transfers to the new member state at the expense of the more recent member states, if not at the expense also of the net beneficiaries who have been quite difficult lately in terms of increase of the EU budget. Think of the agricultural policy, etc., etc. Do you believe that each and every farmer who seem not to be so happy with the way in which things are developing in the European Union, imagine the French farmers being told that actually their revenues will actually go down in order to share the cake with farmers from new member states, including Ukraine, which is by far one of the probably most important actor as far as agriculture is concerned. So what we've been talking about here is just a little foretaste of these discussions to come. And I wonder to what extent these discussions to come will unfortunately slow down the appetite within the Union, at least certain member states, really to engage in a way that is proportionate to the strategic nature, the necessity they have been talking about of enlargement. I fear that in some elections to come in certain member states, the appetite for further enlargement is going to go down. And so we have to be prepared for that and act in a way that prevent as much as possible this enlargement fatigue before enlargement actually settles in.
Those are all good points, but I'd like to point to one difference though, because I remember the discussions we had before the new member states came into the European Union and then into the European Economic Area, 2004. Then there was the discussions about, to simplify it a lot, the Polish plumber workers coming from the new member states taking the jobs of workers in the old member states. And we had 200,000 Polish workers coming to Norway, so it was a significant effect. But now we have, because of the war, free movement of people is already there. There are close to 100,000 Ukrainians being welcomed into Norway already. That changes it a bit, because usually I would say, I think that a new member state, the major concern of many would be free movement of people. How is that going to affect the old member states? But now, because of the war, which is crazy, of course, but you already have sort of free movement of people. Isn't that making it a little bit easier? Because I think it will be difficult to put the toothpaste back into the tube and say, now you all have to go home. I can't see that happening.
No, and I wish to share your positive tone about this. Let's not forget, nonetheless, that in the context of the electoral campaign in Poland. Poland being the country that has really opened its doors first and foremost at the level of civil society rather than at the level of the state authorities under the peace government. But during the electoral campaign, there were already political parties who were trying to capitalize on what they thought would be a degree of frustration, you know, because somehow there was this idea that Ukrainians had better access to some welfare services than some of within the Polish population. And it wouldn't take long before that kind of rhetoric really to be further articulated if it could be, you know, envisaged as a vote winner. So yes, I wish to share your positive presentation of this. And indeed, it's always difficult to put the toothpaste in the tube.
I will continue on this positive note, Maria. So moving back to defense and security and developments, what is the best case scenario 5 years from now?
The best case scenario 5 years from now, a very optimistic scenario, is that we have defeated Russia in the sense that it has been entirely pushed out of Ukraine. Ukraine is a member of NATO. And all of that we have discussed throughout the day in terms of, you know, accountability measures are in place, are being implemented, or on the way there, right? But this is likely not happening all within the 5 years, unless there is this major collapse, which makes it even more difficult to predict about the future within Russia, right? Obviously, you know, the beautiful dream scenario in terms of the long-term vision of how can we all, as it was the trope, the Soviet trope during the Cold War times, live peacefully together, or peaceful coexistence of nations, that would actually necessitate not just, you know, a different regime governing Russia, but also the fundamental process of coming to terms with the past on Russia's part, and also on Russia's society part, which is something we don't necessarily talk about that much right now, because first things first, and obviously everyone is preoccupied. But in the long run, this is something akin to what the German nation went through after the end of the Second World War needs to happen in the Russian society as well. Unless this happens, unless we actually talk about and implement the dismantling of this imperial mentality, we don't have peace either.
Any further comments before we open the floor for questions from the audience? I'm sure there are some. Yes, Lilia.
I have a follow-up to Christoph, because I very much share those concerns about the elections happening in many European countries, but also elections to the European Parliament this year, and well, the European Commission, who's going to be the new head of the European Commission. I think Ursula von der Leyen said that she's going to run again. So there might be major changes happening actually on the side of the EU as well, which has to do with who will be leading both the European Council and the European Commission. So and in this sense, I'm also very much afraid of, I think Gunnar spoke of this, of propaganda and what we hear, because a lot of messages, especially about the Ukrainian refugees or grain or whatever it might be, it could also very well be played actually to undermine not only like Ukraine's cause, I would say, but undermine even trust to your own government within your own country. And I think this is very important actually, because it is not only about saying clearly who is attacking who, and you know why is this is not okay under the international law and so on. But it's also very important that that people within the European countries especially have trust in their government, and you know are not influenced by any like conspiracy theories, for instance, and we see like the particular parties being on the rise in many countries in Europe, and that might actually this trend might continue. So being very cautious about the political messages, especially trying to play like the issues such as refugees, for instance, and so on. And on this matter, also it's interesting, we spoke about it, that Norway, for instance, has not implemented the sanctions against the Russian media, which all the EU countries have implemented, and which I think may be something that you might want to reconsider 2 years into the war. Because as much as I'm worried about the fate of Ukraine, I'm also worried about the way Russia might influence societies within the European countries.
Yes, Chris, I have a couple of additional comments, and in an attempt to be a bit more constructive, and optimistic is too big a word, but a bit more constructive. How could the EU and its member state engage in a more active way in order to prepare an enlargement which no doubt will be extremely complex and demanding? The first is, at the risk of repeating myself slightly, there is a need to confront head-on governments of member states that deviate from the basic rules of the game. And I'm referring here to a couple of governments who are deviating from the rule of law, democracy, respect for fundamental rights. Because as long as this is not confronted head-on, the EU's credibility to promote this, if not to require this from the candidate states, and I'm not talking only about Ukraine here, but from the Western Balkans, will be very diminished, and that's an understatement. So a prerequisite for any kind of credibility in its attempt to transform the candidates into full-fledged functioning member states, and thus to ensure the sustainability of the European integration process, is for the current EU institutions and member states to confront those member states that are not basically observing the basic rules. The second one, and if the credibility of the EU is restored in relation to the candidate states with a view to helping them transforming their structures into the structures of a member state, it will be very important for the EU to be a bit more open than it has been hitherto in the context of an accession process. To cut the story short, presently, you are a third state, you apply for membership, and until you meet all the conditions, you cannot enter, right? It's only when the conditions are fulfilled, and only when all the member states are satisfied that you have fulfilled all the conditions, that then you can become a member state. And this process can take 10, 20 years. And I fear that in the case of the countries we're talking about in the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe, it's going to take some time. Now, the process will work. You will continue to have a momentum if you reward the costly reforms on a regular basis. That it's not, after 20 years of hard work that you get the ultimate reward, which is membership. That means that, in my view, the EU and its member state will have to start opening up the EU governance to the candidate states well before they become full-fledged member state. I am not saying that they will reacquire the privilege of membership before being a member in terms of decision-making rights sitting at the council, but I'm talking about getting observer status in EU institutions well before the usual time, which is once the accession treaty is signed, then the representative of the acceding states may have an observer status in the council, in the parliament, etc. There's nothing in the treaties, nothing in EU law that requires that it's only at that moment that an observer status, that the sort of inclusion in the EU governance can take place. The European Council, Economic and Social Council, has begun to open up its doors to representative of the candidate states. And I see no reason why this could not be done in other institutions of the EU. That would be a pretty good way to prepare the EU institutions to be prepared practically too. And last but not least, We're talking about the enlargement of the EU, but as you pointed out several times already, Halvard, we are also talking about the enlargement of the EEA, not to mention the enlargement of all the network of agreements that Norway has with the EU, which means that the moment Ukraine, Moldova, the Western Balkans become part of the EU, they will then become part of the European Economic Area. They will also become part of other arrangements which involve mutual confidence in the functioning of each other's state apparatus. I'm talking about the surrender procedure agreement, for instance, whereby Norwegian judges execute decisions that are taken by judges from the member state of the EU. Now, all of these mechanisms will be extended to the new member state. So Norway is not a third party in all of this. It's actually a protagonist, and it should start engaging as well. And I'm not talking only in terms of providing financial support. It also means engaging, and this kind of events is very important from that point of view, but we need to do far more than this kind of events. Norway has a role to play in preparing those candidate states to become operational member state of the European Economic Area and other agreements.
And observer status in EU institutions might be interesting for some other non-EU member states as well, but that's an entirely different debate. Are there any questions from the audience? They will have to be a bit brief and concrete, but I will allow a few questions, even though we're a little bit over time. Or is the audience completely out? There is one. There you are.
Is there any place for Turkey in this map?
Yes, there is. For several reasons. One is perhaps, and at the risk of sounding really like I'm throwing buckets of cold water on optimism with respect to this strategic necessity, strategic decision to enlarge the EU to Ukraine and other candidate states. Turkey signed an association agreement. It was one of the first to sign an association agreement with what was then the European Economic Community. We're talking about 1963. And that association agreement specifically said that that association agreement was a first step towards Turkey's accession. It took several decades for Turkey to have this official, which is not a legal, but important status nonetheless, which is the status of candidate states starting accession negotiation. It started in 2005. 2005 was the beginning of the accession negotiations with Turkey. And at the moment, it's become, the member state of the Union, representative of the member state, at least some of them are more and more outspoken about the fact that, yeah, this may be a sort of ongoing accession process. The accession negotiations are there, they have been started, but they are not going to go as far as allowing Turkey to enter the Union. I don't think there is a precedent, but the document which was adopted and which is the first step towards accession negotiation is the so-called negotiating framework. This negotiating framework is basically, as its name indicates, it defines the core position of the EU member states in the context of the negotiations for membership with a third state. The document that was adopted for Turkey contain some really unprecedented and, in my view, highly problematic elements. The first one was at the beginning of that document. You see that though we are starting an accession process, the outcome cannot be defined beforehand. So the member states are adopting a negotiating framework, which is a document for accession negotiation, and they say upfront that we can't anticipate that this will successfully lead to Turkey's accession to the EU. The second thing, which is really remarkable, is that even if it were to lead to accession, there were two paragraphs which were really remarkable in the sense that they foresaw that on the EU side, the member state will introduce permanent safeguard clauses in relation to free movement of people, agricultural policy, and cohesion. In other words, right from the start, they were proposing a second-class membership to Turkey and some kind of second-class citizenship to their population. So all of this to say that probably accession is not on the cards. And if it does take place, it will be a different kind of membership. And so it will probably be something different. But still, Turkey is still considered a candidate state. Every year, when the Commission comes up with its progress report, it includes Turkey. And the member states have tried as much as possible to find some kind of diplomatic ambiguity whereby they always treat Turkey as one of the last of the candidate states when they react to the recommendations of the Commission. And they never really look at it as a candidate state preparing for accession, but rather as a privileged partner with whom it is important to do business. I'm not sure I'm really responding to your question, but it seems to me that the place is the place of an important partner, well, within NATO as well, of course, but an unlikely member state of the European Union in the future.
One more question there in the middle.
Thank you for this really enlightening discussion. I was wondering, since we're talking about what seems like a longer term perspective of EU accession, and Lilia, you touched upon the challenge of capacity inside Ukraine with people going to the trenches instead of sitting and working in law. Is there a role for us as a university in Norway or other Western institutions in helping build the capacity inside Ukraine in preparing lawyers for the future that will work on the Ukrainian side? So what could be the role of a university like the University of Bergen in this?
Thank you so much for your question, Martin. There is definitely a role to play, and we had on stage Artem Nazarko, who is a PhD fellow who is financed by the EU, my career scholarship specifically for Ukrainian researchers. Great initiative to actually integrate Ukrainian researchers into the European setting. So by way of having grants and actually by way of developing networks. Because even if you can apply for such a grant, well, you need to know people, where you could possibly do the research. So I think anything which has to do with developing a network is of great help, that you develop these connections, because you might not know what opportunities there might be in the future, of course. And another thing, we will have the closing word of the Nobel Prize laureate, who will touch upon that a bit. And another one is actually to have Ukrainian students at the institutions in Europe, and especially in Norway now, that introduced the fees for non-EU citizens if they want to study at Norwegian institutions. I think it's one of the last countries who have introduced that. And I think only this week I've seen some news about the scholarships, because this has been really important. Since 2014, we had some scholarships available in different countries to students from Ukraine. I myself benefited from such scholarship in Estonia, for instance. And a lot of people who actually were studying back in different EU countries, they are back in Kiev working for government, working exactly with the issues of EU integration, prosecution of war crimes, and so on. So engaging in any way with Ukrainian institutions and welcoming Ukrainian students is the great way to do that. And of course, Ukraine is part of the Erasmus Plus, so you can also have the direct links to particular institutions and have exchange students, for instance, coming. So I think everything helps, but even starting a network or having this personal connection to a Ukrainian is of great help already. So, thank you.
I think we have to draw the line there. Thanks for very interesting discussions. I'm sure they will continue later over coffee and when we meet again, but this time we have to end now.
So, thank you very much. There will be just 3 more minutes before we close this event. So just a few more minutes before we close this event today, because we have concluding remarks. Unfortunately, it's only a video because May-Britt Muse and Edvard Muse, who are Nobel Prize laureates from Norway in physiology or medicine in 2014, they could not be with us here in Bergen, but we have a video from them. They are also United 24 ambassadors, and they will tell you. So if we could please have the video.
You for the invitation to participate in this event, which I understand is being held because it's 10 years since the war between Russia and Ukraine started, and 2 years since the full-scale invasion. So we're here to say that we stand with you, and now in the roles of being ambassadors for United 24, which is President Zelensky's fundraising initiative. And especially our task is to be ambassadors for science and education, which where we think that we can contribute.
And of course, like Edward says, it's extremely important for us that we give you our support, and we think about you every single day. And we also think that there's at least one thing we can do, and that is to encourage science and education in Ukraine. Because even though you suffer for terrible, terrible aggression to your country, your people shouldn't suffer too much, and especially not the upcoming generation. So if the war would stop science and education, that is a punishment that is horrible, besides all the aggression to your people and to your country. So what we have tried to do is to give lectures ourselves, but we have also recruited other people who we know are extremely good teachers and world-known scientists to show their support and to give lectures. And this is just what we think we can do in a really bad situation. And in this, we really want to give you hope for the future, because the only hope we see is science, education, and hopefully that the aggression will stop.
And we are, of course, acutely aware that war is not only the immediate suffering, but there's also war against science and education institutions, which are severely affected. I think the Science and Education Initiative is important in order to build up Ukraine for a future after the war, which we hope will come soon. But it is important to have a population that continues to be educated, to have scientists who don't all leave the country because of the situation, but to be strong when Ukraine is going to be built up. And that's why we think that it is important for scientists to contribute, and because that's why we are happy to be part of the United 24 Science and Education Initiative.
And science and education is the core of democratic processes that Ukraine will be in very, very soon, and that you are in now, but you suffer from the aggression. But be strong, believe that you can do it, and we think you can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we thank May-Britt and Edvard Muse for this encouraging words, and I think it also gives us some hope. Well, let's hope in science, right, and education, and if we can do just small steps to even establish a connection to Ukrainian researcher as student, it would be of great support for us already. I would also like to mention that this United 24 initiative, you might have seen this flyers just lying around. Those are open for everybody. So they are ambassadors who are engaging in big projects, but you can also donate for your cause. It could be infrastructure, it could be education. So please support Ukraine, please stand with Ukraine, and Slava Ukraini.